Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 19024 in the name of Graham Day, the Minister for Parliamentary Business, on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a timetable on the Stage 3 consideration of the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Scotland Bill. Could I call on Maurice Golden as a member of the Bureau to move this motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. No member wishes to speak against the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 19024 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So the next item is Stage 3 proceedings on the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, the marshalled list, the supplement to the marshalled list, and the grouping of amendments. I would just remind members that the division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds. Thereafter, I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak button as soon as possible after I call the group. So members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And I call Group 1, Minor and Technical Amendments. I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendment 5. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 2 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This grouping contains two very minor technical amendments which need little explanation. Amendment 2 fixes a duplicative section heading in the 2009 Act. Amendment 5 ensures wording consistency between the provisions for calculating annual targets. I move Amendment 2 in my name.
Thank you very much. And as no one else wishes to comment on this group, the question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So we're going to turn now to Group 2 on interim targets. And I call Amendment 17 in the name of Claudia Beamish. And this is grouped with Amendment 18. And I would remind members at this stage that Amendments 17 and 18 are direct alternatives. So direct alternatives are two or more amendments seeking to replace the same text in a bill with alternative approaches. A vote will be taken on both amendments 17 and 18 in the order in which they appear in the marshalled list. If both 17 and 18 were to be agreed to, then the second amendment, that is Amendment 18, succeeds the former, and the first amendment, 17, would cease to have effect. So Claudia Beamish to move Amendment 17 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At Stage 2, it was momentous to see the cross-party consensus that a net zero target was right for Scotland. Today, I'm wholeheartedly delighted that consensus has continued to the setting of an interim target, setting our trajectory for the new decade. And this is the real measure of the bill's strength and this Parliament's success in stepping up to the climate emergency. We are 10 years on from the first Climate Change Act 2009, now armed with a wealth of new research and improved understanding of the task ahead of us. This chamber well knows that the UN say that we now have 11 years to stop irreparable climate damage, and that what happens in the next decade is crucial. The opposition parties came to agree that the SNP's proposal for the 2030 target at 70%, only a few degrees up from what it was back in 2009, wasn't good enough. The real evidence base for this decision had to come from the IPCC, the climate catastrophes we have already been witnessing, and the public mandate from the brilliant climate strikers. It is a political decision, but it is based in science. I came to submit 75 for Stage 3 in the hope that it would be a place of consensus in the midpoint of the fair shares calculation, coming down from our own Scottish Labour higher initial position of 77. I'm delighted this has been successful and that all parties have come to agree. I'm proud of the energy and vision shown at UK Labour's conference this week and the motion agreed on the new Green Deal. Although we are sympathetic to Amendment 18, Labour will today abstain. We look forward to consulting on a unique Scottish position including how we can take action to deliver beyond 75% for the interim target of 2030. Across the parties, there is a clear grasp of the challenges faced by the agriculture and land use sectors in terms of the challenges and need for funding and advisory support in a just transition. It is also acknowledged that many of the carbon accounting systems for farms must be altered to recognise the peat restoration and tree planting and other issues. We have all received significant numbers of emails calling for bolder interim targets. Many of us have also been in dialogue with Extinction Rebellion members about their radical, brave demands. I also expect members across this chamber were at the climate strike last Friday, and I hope their enthusiasm and frustration and unity rocked you all. The interim target is above all justice for those young people. If we set a business as usual target, we will shake their trust in this Parliament, another of the institutions that has failed to take on this issue seriously so far for far too long. I do not want this Parliament to shake its head and turn its back on these brilliant young people and on the generations to come and on the global south. So I urge this chamber to support a stronger interim target for Scotland and show we are truly world leaders, and then to go on from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mark Roskell to speak to Amendments 18 and the other amendment in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have 10 years, just 2 parliamentary sessions left to tackle the climate emergency. That's the challenge laid down by the scientists and by the thousands of young people protesting on our streets. It's the debt from our industrial history that we carry, and it demands that we do our fair and our equitable share. If we don't come out of today with a bill that rises to that challenge, then we will have spectacularly failed ourselves, the young and future generations. The Greens have led the call to strengthen the 2030 targets in this bill. 80% by 2030 would dramatically improve our chances of keeping the world within 1.5 degrees of warming. It will give us the best hope that we can survive extinction. A lower target and the advice from the UK Climate Change Committee are based on a gamble, a 50-50 chance of keeping the world safely within 1.5 degrees. Presiding Officer, would you gamble your children's future on the flip of a coin? I know I wouldn't. The UK Climate Change Committee was clear in its Stage 1 evidence that ramping up action now on areas such as tree planting, agriculture, housing and energy means that we can go much faster, and indeed many of the later amendments today will drive that more ambition. Parliament is waiting for this government to fully review all policies and propose new actions, but we can't wait for yet more delay and years of analysis of our options. We know what needs to be done. We know that a Scottish Green New Deal, using every lever available to transition to a zero-carbon economy, is the transformational change that we need. Now, Labour proposed a moderate increase to the 2030 target to 75%. And I welcome this and the commitment from the SNP today. But it's not enough. We need a clear and bold direction today to do what is necessary and fair, to reduce the risk, to send the strongest signal that the climate emergency demands an emergency response, the only response. It starts here by raising that ambition to 80% by 2030.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. I call Maurice Golden to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's clear that business as usual will only make the dangers presented by climate emergency declared by both the UK and the Scottish governments earlier this year worse. That's why the Scottish Conservatives supported the Scottish Government's commitment to setting a more ambitious emissions target for 2045 and voted in favour of amendments to bring forward interim targets earlier this year. We recognise that urgent action is needed to tackle the climate emergency and to make real progress on reducing our emissions. And so today we will vote for the more ambitious interim target of 75% by 2030.
And Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Lee MacArthur. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My 5 years as Climate Change Minister fundamentally changed my life. When we set a 2050 target, I told colleagues that I hoped to be 104 years old. I'm very grateful that we've brought it forward by 5 years. I only need to be 99 years old in 2045. But even in 2030, I hope to be 84. But therefore, that tells you it's not about a wrinkly old soul like myself. It is about the generations who have to follow. I admire unambiguously and without reservation the efforts of youngsters. We in our committee had a primary age school student come to talk to us, and the most impressive person she was. We owe it to her, to all the youngsters who've been campaigning, to set targets which are realistic, founded in science, and which will be hard for us to actually deliver on. The 75% figure, one initially, I must say, had reservations about. 70% is already world-leading, but 75% entrenches Scotland's position as a world leader in climate change. But there's nothing good about being a world leader if we don't use that leadership to persuade others. We are but 1/700th of the world's emissions. So I hope the Parliament will unite, because there's a united, unanimous view at the end of the day. We will have the credibility to persuade others. We must do that to support future generations. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I rise to support the Amendment 17 in Claudia Beamish's name, which I was also delighted to co-sign. And can I also commend her on her efforts in shuttle diplomacy over recent days, which I think have reaped rewards. It's now widely recognised that we face a climate emergency. Some reach this conclusion sooner than others, but we must now use that general acceptance as a platform from which to launch a more ambitious response to the challenges we face. Scottish Liberal Democrats welcomed the fact that already in this process of scrutinising the bill, Parliament has chosen to adopt a target of net zero emissions by 2045. This represents an important step forward in both ambition and in urgency. It was one supported by the advice of the UK CCC. But setting such a target would be largely symbolic unless we also commit to greater ambition and urgency in the early stages over the next decade. The IPCC report in 2018 could not have been clearer. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade requires, quote, rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Moreover, the IPCC confirmed that what happens between now and 2030 is crucial. In response to this advice, I believe that setting a target of 70% reduction in emissions by 2030 is inadequate. It represents only a marginal increase over what was set in the 2009 Act. And as the UKCCC itself acknowledged, it emerged from simply drawing a straight line from emissions in 2020 to the date of net zero. I think setting a more ambitious target for 2030 still needs to be based on what is realistic and achievable, though. If nothing else, this allows us to take people with us to ensure that they can and will play their part in the necessary transition. There's been much discussion with colleagues across parties about what an appropriate figure might be, and I welcome that cross-party engagement that I think has characterised the scrutiny of this bill overall. But I believe 75% sets the right balance. It is stretching, it will be extremely challenging, but it is achievable and sets us on a course for net zero emissions by 2045. To go beyond 75% at this stage, and there should, of course, be scope within this bill for targets to be reviewed as evidence and opportunities change. But at this stage, to go further lacks, I believe, credibility, and therefore I support the amendment in Claudia Beamish's name.
Thank you. And I call the Cabinet Secretary, Rosanna Cunningham.
Presiding Officer, throughout the bill process, the Scottish Government has remained committed to following the independent expert advice of the Committee on Climate Change on what constitutes the most ambitious targets that are also credible. We immediately lodged amendments at stage 2 to put the CCC's recommended targets, including net zero by 2045 and a 70% reduction by 2030, into the bill. The approach of following the CCC's advice is also what the ACCLR committee called for in its stage 2 report on the bill. One of the key strengths of Scotland's approach to emissions reductions, and one of the reasons why it's been so successful to date, is the reliance on an evidence-based approach based on the best available scientific advice. This government remains committed to maintaining that link between the evidence and the pathway we place Scotland on for the years to come. The CCC has set out the most robust scientific assessment of the right targets for Scotland and the UK. It is clear that our 2045 net zero target is correct and the most ambitious scientifically feasible. The CCC itself has also set out that there is a gap in their detailed analysis of the path for emissions in the years up to 2045. In the absence of that detailed work, which they have committed to undertake, their initial analysis suggested that the right target for Scotland for 2030 was 70%. They explicitly said that they had chosen a prudent target of 70%, and we've always been clear that we believe this meets the requirements of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Mark Ruskell.
For giving way. Could the Cabinet Secretary reflect on whether it's credible to seek advice based on only a 50% chance of actually keeping global temperatures within 1.5 degrees? Isn't that selling out future generations here today?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll ensure that the Committee on Climate Change is aware of Mark Ruskell's views of their expertise. However, it is clear that now is the time for even greater ambition in tackling the world's climate emergency, and that signals matter. That's why we will today commit to going further and adopt a target of a 75% reduction in Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 by supporting the Labour amendment. But we will also commit to seeking further, more detailed advice from the CCC next year on this new 2030 target. Both a 70% and a 75% reduction more than meets what the IPCC special report says is needed globally over the next decade to prevent warming of more than 1.5 degrees. All parties supporting this amendment must understand how enormously challenging a 75% target will be, and must be prepared to join us in making the difficult delivery decisions that will follow. In agreeing to by far the most ambitious statutory target for 2030 of any country anywhere in the world, Parliament is committing itself to supporting the pathway set out in the bill and the tough policies required by that pathway. Let me be clear to opposition parties in this chamber. When recent proposals have been put forward to tackle emissions, for instance, introducing a workplace parking levy, they have been met with fierce opposition. To have any hope of achieving a higher target for 2030, those parties who are calling for the higher target and claim to be serious about tackling climate change will need to back such assertions with action. If Parliament sets this target, it is no longer an option for any party to stand in the way of the measures we need to take to tackle climate change. The target also represents a clear challenge to the UK government to step up and match Scotland's high ambition. The current UK target for 2030 of a 57% reduction will not support the delivery of a 75% reduction here in Scotland. I would invite members to note that the CCC's recommended 70% target for 2030, let alone 75%, would be the most ambitious in law of any country in the world. I've already referred to the UK's current target of 57%. The EU's current target is for 40%, and Sweden's main target for that year, which is across some sectors only, is for 63%. I would therefore urge members to reject the Green Party Amendment 18.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Claudia Beamish to wind up and to press or withdraw the amendment in her name.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to start by thanking Liam MacArthur for supporting the Scottish Labour amendment, and also the Tories as well, and recognise that the Greens have gone further today, and Scottish Labour will be consulting on an 80% target, in part in view of what happened at our conference yesterday in relation to the Green Jobs Revolution, and we'll see where we go with that. I think it's imperative that all of us across this chamber continue to assess if we can go further than we've gone today. Although I've listened to what the Cabinet Secretary is saying, and we have to do it in a way that supports communities and workers and the global south. So I think that's a very important issue to do. I mean, Stuart Stevenson highlighted the issue around calling ourselves world leaders, and I think we are certainly up there. And in relation to the fact that, very excitingly, next year that the COP will be coming to Glasgow. We can all push forward as hard as we can to make sure that we are the very best, so that we can be a really strong example to the world, and also as a developing country make sure that we don't impact heavily or indeed at all, if possible, on the global south. I wanted just to recognise very briefly, if I may, Presiding Officer, that I'm sat next to Sarah Boyack, and that Stuart Stevenson was also involved in the 2009 Act, and recognise their work and those that put that into law in Scotland then, and how far we've come, and also how far we have to go. Sarah's just reminded me that it's 3 parliaments from now when those targets will be coming to fruition, we hope and expect. And which of us will be here? In a sense, that doesn't really matter. What does matter is that our children and our children's children are more likely to be able to have a real future and a real quality of life, and that children across the world are less likely to be climate migrants, and are also, it's possible, we hope, that they'll be able to stay where they are and have a good quality of life as well, wherever they are. So let's be sure that we reach these targets in an equitable way, and I move, or do I press the amendment in my name? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms Beamish. And the question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 18 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated? Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We're going to move to a division. Now, this is the first division of the afternoon, so I'm going to suspend the Parliament for 5 minutes while I summon members to the chamber. Parliament suspended for 5 minutes. Thank you, colleagues. That's our 5 minutes, so if colleagues could resume their seats, we're going to move to the vote. And the question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may press their buttons now. The result of the vote on amendment number 18 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 7, no 92. There were 19 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We turn now to Group 3, Sustainable Development and Climate Justice. Can I call Amendment 19 in the name of Claudia Beamish, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings. Claudia Beamish to move Amendment 19 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Sorry, 19. This group 3, yeah? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm feeling overwhelmed already. Okay, on we go. These amendments are designed to see Scotland stand up for climate justice, that ministers act with respect to Scotland's historic high emissions and support the Global South in its own climate action. Members will recall I had amendments at stage 2 which covered these issues, and my thanks to the government for dialogue over the summer. We must play our part and do no further harm. Amendment 10 adds a climate justice principle to the face of the bill, defined as the importance of mitigation and adaptation to climate change in ways which support people who are most affected by climate change, but who have done least to cause it, and indeed are the least equipped to adapt to its effects in ways that help address inequality. This amendment is so significant, and its addition to the bill cannot be underestimated. Climate change is inextricably linked with human rights and exacerbates inequality by disproportionately affecting already marginalised people. In the Global South especially, the lives, health, housing, sanitation, food and water are all put on the line by developing countries dragging their feet and making decisions which suit ourselves. Amendment 10 adds the climate justice principle and means that ministers must have regard to this principle when preparing climate change plans. This is welcome, and I urge all to support it today, and also to support Amendment 19, which adds reference to the principle to the target-setting criteria. This is a much more meaningful way to deliver climate justice, including it in the approach to overall ambition and speed of tackling climate change rather than just in our domestic emissions reduction plan. Amendment 4 further amends the definition of the fair and safe emissions budget for Scotland already in the bill to include reference to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 3. This article includes extremely worthy principles, including equity, common but differentiated responsibility, special circumstances of developing country parties, and the precautionary principle, sustainable development, and support for sustainable economic growth. My Amendment 20, however, goes somewhat further than Amendment 4, and I hope there will be support for it today across the Chamber, in that it makes explicit the reference to the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility. These are the essence of ensuring the fair part of the fair and safe budget. I understand the Cabinet Secretary has concerns regarding competing hierarchies, but without Amendment 20, these vital aspects are absent from the face of the bill and only exist in a reference. Amendment 6 is also a result of dialogue with the Cabinet Secretary following stage 2, and it adds supporting action in developing countries to tackle climate change to the scope of the climate change plans themselves. It specifically requires ministers to set out how they will do so by sharing the expertise and technology. This is further in line with Scotland's delivery of climate justice, which we have a strong record on, led by the Scottish Government, and supporting those least equipped to deal with the crisis, not of their own making. Finally, in this group, I have a number of amendments relating to Sustainable Development Goals. Amendment 3 adds Sustainable Development considerations, including the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to the target setting criteria, while Amendment 12 requires the climate change plans must set out how they are expected to contribute to achieving Sustainable Development Goals. And Amendment 14 adds reference to these goals to the general duty in relation to sustainable development in section 92, going back to the 2009 Act. I have further amendments 12A and 14A, both of which add in the stipulation that consideration should be taken to ensure that Scotland's actions do not negatively impact on the ability of other countries to achieve sustainable development. These add a much stronger duty and properly accounts for the do no harm principle, which in reality is do no more harm. Amendments 9 and 11 are minor consequentials, and Amendment 16 provides a definition of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I will also support Angus MacDonald's Amendment 1, making important reference to the 1.5 degree target, which we all have to stay under if we are going to have a safe and prosperous world for all in the future. I urge members to pass all these amendments in this group and show the world that Scotland is a member of the global community and is taking a moral approach for all across the world to the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Angus MacDonald to speak to Amendment 1 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This amendment is similar to Amendment 97, which I lodged at Stage 2, and can I thank the Government for its assistance in refining the amendment. It ensures that regular independent expert advice will be sought and published on how Scotland's targets relate to global efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, needless to say, I'm pleased that both my Eclair Committee and the Scottish Government have recognised the importance of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on warming of 1.5 degrees. The Committee on Climate Change describes their subsequent target recommendations for Scotland, which are reflected in the bill as it stands, as being, and I quote, towards the high end of the estimated range of necessary reductions for a limit of 1.5 degrees. It's therefore incredibly important that the targets continue to be kept under regular review in light of further developments in the science and the progress of efforts in other countries. The bill ensures that updated advice from the Committee on Climate Change will be sought at least every 5 years. These requests for advice will include the CCC's views on the appropriate level for the fair and safe emissions budget for Scotland, which is defined in relation to the internationally agreed global temperature aim set out in the Paris Agreement, and that aim references well below 2 degrees centigrade as well as 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, in effect, this amendment provides a way to ensure that expert advice on how Scotland's targets relate to the particular 1.5 degree centigrade aspect of the Paris goal, in particular, will continue to be sought and made available. Presiding Officer, I would urge the Chamber to support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Claudia Beamish and Angus MacDonald in moving these amendments. The bill is a response to the Paris Agreement, and the spirit and substance of Paris must be delivered into the heart of this bill. Our industrial revolution created a huge climate debt that's been passed on to communities around the world, communities who've barely even begun their own development journey. We have to allow countries in the developing world the room to breathe in this climate emergency. Our target setting must be equitable, and we have to be mindful of the climate injustice and suffering that is already happening in a world with just 1 degree of warming, let alone what may come in the decades ahead. Our role must also be to smooth the path to sustainable development for all countries and not to put barriers in their way through our own actions at home. So for those reasons, we strongly back all the amendments in this group.
Thank you. And I call Sarah Boyack to be followed by the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do want to support all of these amendments in this group because it is about being cross-cutting and it is about global action. The key issue about the UN Sustainable Development Goals is there is no one policy lever. We need to make sure that climate action cuts right across all of those issues across the world, whether it's housing, transport, energy, economy, biodiversity, flooding or equalities. All of the SDGs need to be acted on. And we need to have at the forefront the concept of global justice, so that when we work through United Nations and support for the Global South, we acknowledge they are already facing huge poverty and inequalities, and action has got to be factored into all of our trade, aid and business policies. I particularly want to thank SCIAF for the work they've done in promoting these amendments this afternoon, but also for the work of so many of our charities, for the work that they do at the moment, supporting countries and supporting people who are already experiencing what climate change will be like across the globe. Groups like Oxfam, Tearfund, Christian Aid, their work is essential. As we see sea level rises, we will see people being shifted from their countries. We're already seeing that impact in places like Bangladesh, and we already see people who are climate refugees. This year, 2019, is being seen as one of the worst, most disastrous years in memory. People who have had to leave their homes because of climate change. And that's something we need to focus on. Floods, landslides, tornadoes and other natural disasters. Now, not all of these natural disasters are directly the result of our climate emergency, but they give us an insight as to what the future holds if we do not act. So let's all support these amendments. I hope colleagues in every party will support these amendments because they're practical, but they're also ethical. They're about what we need to do. If we say that we are one of the most radical countries in the world tackling our climate emergency, we have got to follow through in all of our policy delivery and all of our government's action. So I support these amendments and hope colleagues will this afternoon. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And actually, before I call the Cabinet Secretary, can I call Maurice Coulden?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We support the principles of international environmental law and indeed the intention behind much of these amendments. Not fully convinced that the codification of international environmental law into this bill is necessary or required, but nonetheless we are sympathetic to much of the amendments in this group. However, on 12A and 14A, which seek to not negatively impact the sustainable development of other countries, we have grave concerns that this could create a legal precedence whereby Scottish ministers and indeed the Scottish Government would be unable to make the necessary changes in order to tackle climate change, in order to instigate new sectors or industries or indeed jobs, as this could have an impact on other countries. And I wouldn't want this bill to lead to further legal disputes and indeed constrain our ability to tackle climate change. And on that basis, for those amendments, we will not be able to support.
And Cabinet Secretary.
Firstly, I'm happy to support Amendment 1 from Angus MacDonald, which represents a sensible way to further reflect the importance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in the bill. The Scottish Government has accepted the vital message of the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees and is committed to contributing to global efforts to reach this. We must, however, be realistic as to what any one small country can do to affect global emissions levels. The statutory framework around targets needs to reflect this reality, as well as Scotland's leadership. At stage 2, we amended the bill to explicitly link the definition of Scotland's fair and safe emissions budget to the Paris Agreement global temperature goal, which is to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue further efforts to 1.5 degrees. Angus MacDonald's amendment provides a useful and complementary addition to the target framework by requiring ministers to regularly ask the CCC for additional advice on how Scotland's targets will contribute to global efforts to the 1.5 degrees aspect of the Paris goal in particular. I'll now turn to the suite of amendments from Claudia Beamish, with whom there was constructive engagement over the summer. I was, however, just a little disappointed to see further amendments then lodged, which undermined some of the areas in which I had thought we'd established consensus. I am sympathetic to the underlying purpose of this grouping. Climate change is a global challenge, and it is right that this is clearly reflected in our domestic legislation, including through recognising the interactions between actions to reduce emissions and sustainable development. Scotland is a responsible global citizen, and we recognise our moral obligation to contribute to the challenge of climate change and to influence others to do the same. I am content to support Claudia Beamish's amendments where these will work to reflect these considerations in the target framework of this Act in a workable and appropriate way. The Scottish Government's National Performance Framework is Scotland's way to localise and implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The framework has a focus on tackling inequalities so that no one in Scotland is left behind as we work together to achieve the goals. Amendments 3, 11, 12, 14 and 16 from Claudia Beamish provide a strong package to reflect the importance of this policy coherence around sustainable development at the heart of our climate change legislation. Amendment 6 ensures that climate change plans will include a section on action to support developing countries in tackling climate change, as well as the actions to reduce emissions here in Scotland. Amendments 9 and 10 place Scotland's existing proven commitment to climate justice on the face of the bill, recognising that those who have done least to cause climate change are often the ones that suffer the most from its effects. As I've already said, tackling inequalities must be central to our approach, and this amendment further recognises that. Amendment 4 updates the definition of Scotland's fair and safe emissions budget, the level of which is recommended independently by the Committee on Climate Change, to link this to the internationally agreed set of principles set out by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So these amendments will significantly strengthen the role of sustainable development and climate justice in Scotland's climate change legislation. I cannot, however, support amendments 20, 19, 12A or 14A, and I must urge members to reject these. Amendment 20 seeks to further amend the definition of the fair and safe emissions budget to highlight specific and selective wording from the UNFCCC principles. This approach does risk creating presentational and legal hierarchies by suggesting that these elements of the principles are more important than others. It also fails to recognise all aspects of Article 3.1 of the UNFCCC where these principles are outlined. That article sets out that developed countries should lead action to tackle climate change, precisely what Scotland is doing. I would urge members to support Amendment 4 from Claudia Beamish, as I've already indicated, which does refer to the UNFCCC principles in the round, and to reject Amendment 20. These two amendments cannot both be sensibly agreed to. Amendment 19 is, in my view, unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. It seeks to add the climate justice principle to the target-setting criteria. Whilst I'm supportive of the principle itself, I consider that this ground is sufficiently well covered by the existing set of criteria, and adding further principles to this would at best add no value and could at worst cause confusion. The statutory target-setting criteria already include economic circumstances, including a particular requirement to consider jobs and employment opportunities, social circumstances, in particular the likely impact on those living in poorer or more deprived communities, and the likely impact of those living in remote rural and island communities. If Amendment 4 is agreed, the UNFCCC principles will also be referred to within the criteria through the fair and safe emissions budget. I would also invite members to consider that the statutory just transition principles, which we will discuss further in a later grouping, do not form part of the criteria. It would seem inconsistent to highlight one of our climate change plan principles over these other ones in the way proposed. Amendments 12A and 14A, which seek to directly amend Claudia Beamish's own amendments, are entirely impractical. I cannot support proposals that would require, in law, assessments to be made of the impact of Scottish policies on the ability of other countries to achieve sustainable development outcomes. It is entirely unclear from these amendments how such assessments could be robustly and meaningfully undertaken. It is, for example, unclear whether this duty should apply to all other countries, and if not, to which ones. Amendment 6 requires ministers to set out the positive actions they are taking to support developing countries in tackling climate change, and we think that this is the right way forward. To be clear, I could not support Amendment 12 or 14, which are otherwise positive measures, if Amendments 12A and 14A were to be agreed. So, in summary, I urge members to support all of the amendments in this group other than numbers 2019, 12A and 14A, which risk undermining the positive effects that will be achieved by the others.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Claudia Beamish to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 19.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was indeed pleased to work with the Cabinet Secretary over the summer, and that was in terms of the amendments that we discussed, as far as it was possible to go together. And in discussion with SCIAF and other groups, we decided that we wanted to go further, and that is something that the Parliament will have to decide if they want to join in supporting the Global South in what we see as the most robust way possible. And the Sustainable Development Goals, as Sarah Boyack has highlighted, have no one policy lever, and climate justice is something that encompasses all our actions in policy, and our policy should be judged against those as a developed country. I'm puzzled by what Maurice Golden says, and I don't understand any examples. He hasn't given any examples of how what we're doing here would affect what we do would affect the Global South in a way that is negative, that prevents him from supporting our amendments. So I don't know if he could clarify that at all, but if he will, I'm happy to listen. But
yes, but briefly, we're running out of time. Maurice Golden.
Okay. For example, if you're producing a new product here, a circular economy product here in Scotland, that can clearly have an impact on the abilities of other countries who may be producing that similar product. And therefore, by putting that in statute, then it can be counterintuitive.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank Maurice Golden for that explanation, but I still don't agree with him, because I don't think that creating a similar product is going to prevent anyone else creating one. And the whole idea of the global climate justice is that we don't actually impact, not simply because we produce a product that they might produce, but actually by doing things that will affect them negatively in terms of climate change itself. We do have a global responsibility to assure we do not negatively impact on the ability of other countries, indeed, to act. And I do disagree with the Cabinet Secretary in terms of the principles in the article that she's highlighted. I don't think that this, I think that these articles are these principles are so important that we should be highlighting them on the face of the bill. And in terms of the target setting, I think it's fundamentally important that we recognise the issue of climate justice in the setting of every target. So I hope members will support that and all the other amendments which I've highlighted in the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Beamish. So the question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. This will be a 1-minute division. The result of the vote on amendment number 19 in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes 34, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 3 in the name of Claudia Beamish to move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 20? Claudia Beamish to move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. Amendment 20. This is the 30-second vote. The result of the vote on amendment number 20 in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes 34, no 86. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 4 in the name of Claudia Beamish? Claudia Beamish to move?
Move.
Thank you very much. The question is that amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 1 in the name of Angus MacDonald? Angus MacDonald to move?
Firmly pressed.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. It is passed, Mr MacDonald. Now we turn to Group 4, Citizens' Assembly, and I call Amendment 21 in the name of Mark Ruskell, in a group on its own. Mark Ruskell to move and speak to Amendment 21.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. It was indeed firmly pressed, that amendment. I could hear it from here. Can I just say I'm pleased I am to move then Amendment 21 on the establishment of a Climate Citizens' Assembly. And can I welcome the cross-portfolio discussions that have been taking place with Patrick Harvey, Michael Russell and Rosanna Cunningham and myself on this. And I'd also like to thank those activists from outside Parliament, maybe even some of them maybe inside Parliament today, I don't know, who've pushed hard for such an assembly to be set up. It is clear that we are going to face unprecedented societal change in the years ahead, and how we take people with us in designing and preparing for hard choices will be absolutely critical. So a citizens' assembly is essential to understand the issues, set the agendas and test the solutions that will go beyond our current thinking about what is possible. Now, the Irish Citizens' Assembly's work on climate should be a strong inspiration for our own. By feeding its work to ministers and Parliament, it set in train new actions for Ireland's climate action plan. And it was able to consider issues such as tax policy, which were too thorny at first for the politicians to consider, but they eventually caught up on that one. So I look forward to the establishment of Scotland's first ever Climate Citizens' Assembly, and I hope that it will light the path to tackling the climate emergency.
Thank you very much, Mr Ruskell. Can I call Liam MacArthur? Thanks, President Officer. Can I thank Mark Ruskell for lodging Amendment 21 and setting out very clearly the case for the Citizens' Assembly and Scottish Liberal Democrats very much support. That I would add that this is precisely the sort of circumstance in which the use of citizens' assemblies is justified and where they can make a real contribution, as Mark Ruskell says, in identifying ways of achieving a genuinely shared objective, I think perhaps in contrast to other instances that are currently being proposed. How such citizens' assemblies would interact with other sources of advice, evidence and expertise is an obvious question, but there seems nothing in what Mark Ruskell is proposing that would preclude that happening in ways that would inform and support the work of the Citizens' Assembly themselves, as well as ensuring ministers are able to draw on the advice that they will continue to need and when they need it. So I look forward to hearing the Cabinet Secretary's comments, but for now, very much welcome Mark Ruskell's amendment.
Thank you very much. And I call on Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the climate emergency, I believe that the Climate Citizens' Assembly is a necessary step in terms of being inclusive and in terms of behaviour change. And it helps people to connect with the Parliament. And we have seen already in our Eclair committee that we invited young people in, and that was really effective. And I think we need to go that further step to allow people to have that discussion beyond the Parliament, who maybe sometimes don't feel they can come to Parliament, and so we are supportive of it. I do want to say, though, that looking back to Tuesday, not that far back, to the Supreme Court decision how Parliament is sovereign. I do feel uncomfortable about the view of some people who have been approaching us in relation to the Citizens' Assembly for climate change, that they would like to see this Parliament being bound by their deliberations. And that, I don't believe, in a parliamentary democracy is something that we can possibly support. We can be inspired by, we can be influenced by, but we cannot be bound in a parliamentary democracy by a Citizens' Assembly. So I simply wanted to highlight that point, but we will be supporting today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government supports the use of deliberative democracy in Scotland, where a problem requires a longer-term approach, a change of perspective, or a development in the way we as a country discuss an issue, then involving the people of Scotland directly in the debate is the right thing to do. We won't solve the most challenging issues of the day if we don't listen to each other, if we don't hear and understand what the experts have to say and what the people are most concerned about, or if we don't, as a country, commit ourselves to a more respectful, balanced and informed dialogue. The Cabinet Secretary for Government, Business and Constitutional Relations set out the case for citizens' assemblies generally in the Chamber in a recent debate, and there was support from across the parties for assemblies to look at the most challenging issues of our day, including support for an assembly on climate change. Climate change is an issue well suited to a citizens' assembly. It is certainly one of the most challenging issues of our day, requiring difficult decisions to be made, and it is one that affects the daily lives and futures of every one of us. I'm happy to support the present amendment to mandate the establishment of a Scottish Citizens' Assembly on climate change. Assemblies work when they are independent, and this amendment requires that. And more than anything else, citizens' assemblies need to be established with a strong commitment by a country's government and parliament that they will take seriously the evidence gathered by the Assembly and the recommendations an Assembly produces. This amendment guarantees that too. It requires the Assembly to lay its report before Parliament and provide a copy to the Scottish Ministers, to which they must then respond. I therefore support this amendment and look forward to working with parties across the Parliament to establish Scotland's Citizens' Assembly on climate change during the remainder of this parliamentary session.
Thank you. And I call on Mark Ruskell to wind up and to press the amendment.
Yeah, thanks. And can I thank members from across parties for support for this amendment. You know, we're seeing deliberative democracy really taking off in Scotland, participatory budgeting. In the Environment Committee, we've held our own citizens' jury on the future of agricultural subsidies as well. And it's genuinely engaging. It accesses views that otherwise we wouldn't hear. It brings in new voices into decision-making and thinking, which I think is hugely important. I think there is a danger sometimes when these initiatives are established that expectations run incredibly high. I think the expectations of this Assembly are very clear. This isn't a decision-making body. This is a body that will produce reports and advice and thinking, which then government and indeed committees of this Parliament can then consider. I don't believe it should have responsibility to take decisions. That rightly lies with us in this Parliament. But we should actively engage with the results and the work of the Citizens' Assembly and consider that in our own business in Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Ruskell. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary? Already debated. Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
Formally. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We turn now to Group 5, approval of relevant public body budgets. Can I call Amendment 22 in the name of Mark Ruskell in a group on its own, and Mark Ruskell to move and speak to Amendment 22.
Thanks. I think it was last year that the National Grid noticed a sudden and huge drop in electricity consumption in Dundee. And it actually took them a while to work out that it was due to Ninewells Hospital. There was something happening at the hospital. A few phone calls later confirmed that the hospital was okay. There was no problem here. It's just that they'd had their new energy system switched over, and it immediately started to make a massive impact on the grid. So the decisions that public bodies make, especially around their infrastructure, are very significant in terms of how we tackle climate change. They can either lock in emissions for decades, or they can make big emission savings, which can also deliver equally big financial savings. Tackling the climate emergency means getting every institution's actions and spending going in the right direction. We need to understand how public bodies are contributing to the solution on both the capital and revenue sides of their budgets. So this amendment will drive that conversation between public bodies and government in support of the delivery of targets in this bill.
Thank you very much. And I call Sarah Boyack.
We definitely want to support this amendment because every single one of our public bodies should, as a matter of course, be mainstreaming action on climate change, and that should be something that is agreed before their budgets are agreed. It's about leadership, it's about culture, and it's also about thinking proactively about public procurement so that every investment and expenditure decision actually thinks through the impact of climate change, whether it's about resilience to climate change or whether it's about lowering our carbon emissions. So we very much support this amendment. It's a short amendment, but potentially one that has a big impact in terms of leadership and in terms of delivery on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, whilst I have sympathy for the motivation for this amendment, I cannot support it. This is because a better way forward is not only available, but already in train. The Scottish Government is currently consulting on the role of public sector bodies in tackling climate change. This includes a specific question in relation to whether such bodies should report annually on how they use their resources to contribute to reducing emissions. Once the consultation is complete, the Scottish Government will bring forward secondary legislation to update the statutory reporting duties under the 2009 Act. There are several reasons why this, rather than the present amendment, is the right way to progress the entirely legitimate questions of how the public sector are supporting emissions reductions. Firstly, the review covers the full range of public sector bodies in Scotland. In contrast, the proposed amendment will exclude many significant players by framing itself in terms of only those bodies for which ministers must approve proposals for the use of resources. Secondly, the proposed amendment would not capture any UK public bodies operating in Scotland, such as HMRC and DWP. And just yesterday, I wrote to the UK Government asking them to decarbonise their estates and operations in Scotland in time to allow our net zero date of 2045 to be met, rather than their target date of 2050.
Sarah Boyack.
How the Cabinet Secretary thinks we could legislate here to instruct UK government agencies to do something that's up to them to decide. We can influence, but how could we have legislative required them to do that?
Perhaps if the member listens to what I've actually said, I've written to the Cabinet, to the Secretary of State in Westminster, asking them to agree to what we are going to discuss in terms of public sector bodies. Of course, we can't legislate for their public sector bodies, but their emissions will add to our emission stats. So I'm asking them to come on board with this. The point I'm making is that there's a group of public sector bodies which don't submit their budgets to us. But the proposed amendment wouldn't capture all public bodies, even those within the devolved arena. It would exclude those such as Scottish local authorities, health boards and Crown Estate Scotland, where budgets are their own to set. In contrast, all of these bodies are captured by the public sector reporting duty, so pursuing that route forward would be substantially more effective. So for these reasons, I urge members to reject this amendment.
Thank you. And I call on Mark Ruskell to wind up and to press Amendment 22 if
Thanks. I feel I've been listening to this debate for some time now. I mean, Sarah Boyack talks about mainstreaming and public procurement. We talked about this in the second session, and yet we still are not seeing significant action from government to actually crack this. The government here has a climate change bill. This was the opportunity to put in provisions around public bodies, around a whole raft of other areas that are needed to tackle the climate emergency, to actually ensure that every single institution in this country is working together. So, it's disappointing to see opposition here today. We had a discussion over the summer around this. I respect the fact that there are consultations ongoing, but this is the moment. This is the moment to actually put something into legislation. It might not capture absolutely everything, but it moves things forward significantly. We had evidence coming to committee, in particular from the NHS, about the importance of this, about the importance of reducing energy importance of tackling climate change and also improving the financial bottom line in many of our public institutions. You know, we should be driving this right now. Just because there isn't, this amendment isn't complete in its scope doesn't mean that we can't be passing it now and then consulting on other areas which are not included in this amendment to then improve action over time.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. And the question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. This will be a 1-minute division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 22 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 28, no 93. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 6, Nitrogen Balance Sheet, and I call Amendment 23 in the name of Maurice Golden, grouped with Manuscript Amendment 23A. Maurice Golden to move Amendments 23 and 23A and to speak to both amendments.
Okay. I'd like to move Amendment 23 and 23A as they seek to introduce a requirement for Scottish ministers to create a balance sheet to measure nitrogen flows across all sectors and media in Scotland within 18 months of passing the bill. I thank the presiding officer for accepting my manuscript amendment, which allows that, which seeks to change from 12 months to 18 months the timescales associated with that amendment. I think that will allow more time for research, modelling and consultation, and therefore is entirely more appropriate. Because nitrogen balance sheets are an established technique for understanding nitrogen flows across all sectors of the economy. A nitrogen balance sheet would allow us to calculate nitrogen use efficiency across Scotland, and it would allow a baseline figure for nitrogen use efficiency and show areas where nitrogen should be used more efficiently. This would help us develop fair, evidence-based policies to identify and tackle nitrogen loss across the whole of the economy, and also ensure that nitrogen efficiency is monitored and reported on to ensure that policy always reflects practice. The Scottish Government committed to developing a national nitrogen balance sheet in this year's programme for government, and I would hope that we have support not just from the SNP but across the Chamber on these amendments.
Thank you very much. And I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
I very much welcome this amendment, and in particular the change to 18 months. It's worth saying that John Scott and myself in committee have both been concerned about the position in relation to the way the International Inventory of Greenhouse Gases works in relation to agriculture, because the inventory is very unfair in reflecting the true cost and benefit of agriculture. Because it doesn't attribute to agriculture things like forestry, it doesn't attribute to agriculture things like renewable energy. I think this plays its own part in giving us a better understanding of the positive impact that agriculture and agroforestry, for that matter, can have on this particular agenda. Out with this chamber, there has been too much lazy commentary, bluntly, not looking at the full facts related to agriculture. So I think this proposal from Maurice Golden is one that I'm happy to support on that basis and for many other reasons as well, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Can I welcome this amendment? The case for a nitrogen budget for Scotland has been building for several years now, and this approach will cut pollution, waste and energy usage while saving money, especially for farmers. Our fields are currently drenched with a staggering excess of 87 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Now, this is not only an expensive waste of inputs, the subsequent cost of pollution cleanups in water and air is then, of course, borne by taxpayers. The starting point in this budget, I hope, will be compulsory soil testing, one of the recommendations of the UK Climate Change Committee that the Scottish Government hasn't adopted yet. But it should also lead to innovation in new technologies that value nitrogen as the important resource that it is.
I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to speak in support very briefly of Maurice Golden's important amendment and identify myself with the remarks of other members who have highlighted these issues, because it is a challenge for farmers when a lot of what they do isn't recognised, and I think that the nitrogen balance sheet will help. Of course, it relates to other sectors as well, but we've grappled with nitrogen in committee in this Parliament and in the last Parliament for quite a time, and I think that it's very timely, if not, not before time, that we are actually able to support this amendment today, and I really hope it goes through.
I call Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Like others, I'm rise to speak in support of the amendment. I think the manuscript amendment is very welcome in terms of buying a little bit further time. There seems to be some concerns around the flexibility over the longer term, but I don't think any of those are insurmountable. And I think, as Stuart Stevenson absolutely rightly pointed out, I think providing that greater balance about the pros and cons that agriculture will play in helping us meet our climate change challenges going forward is in part addressed through this amendment. So therefore, I very much welcome and confirm that Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting it.
Thank you, and I call the Cabinet Secretary.
As indicated by Maurice Golden, the Scottish Government has already committed in the Programme for Government to preparing a nationwide nitrogen balance sheet. We recognise the value that such information can have in better understanding Scotland's nitrogen cycle and allowing us to take a systemic approach to improving nitrogen use efficiency and reducing nitrogen waste throughout the entire economy. The first stage of the work to create a balance sheet is necessarily research to explore the available evidence, and this will take some time if it is to be done well. The amendment, as originally lodged, did pose some technical difficulties. It would have meant that the government had substantially less time to undertake the necessary initial research. So I am very grateful to Maurice Golden for being willing to listen to these concerns and bring forward a manuscript amendment to make the timing requirement more realistic. On this basis, I have no reservations in supporting the amendment.
I call on Maurice Golden to sum up and to press Amendment 23 or withdraw. 23A.
Yes, welcome the comments from across the chamber, and I would like to press.
Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 23A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the question is that Amendment 23 as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We turn now to Group 7, Emissions attributable to Consumption of Goods and Services, Reports and Proposals and Policies. Can I call Amendment 24 in the name of Mark Ruskell, grouped with Amendment 34, Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 24 and to speak to both amendments?
Thanks. It would be blinkered to solely focus on cutting emissions at home, only then to increase emissions through the consumption of products that are made abroad. The picture is unfortunately worsening. We live in a consumer society. Consumption emissions are not falling fast enough, and those that are embedded in imported goods and services are rising. Getting a grip on this picture means reporting consumption emissions by sector and then addressing how these can then be cut through the climate change plan. I welcome the constructive discussions held with government on the consumption question and their support in bringing forward amendments 24 and 34.
Thank you very much. There don't appear to be anybody else. Cabinet Secretary.
I'm content to support both of these amendments, and I'm grateful to Mark Ruskell for working with the government on these over the summer. Consumption-based emissions associated with imported goods and services, commonly referred to as our carbon footprint, form an important part of the wider climate change picture. Scotland is already a leader in this regard, being one of the very few countries to publish regular official statistics on its carbon footprint, and one of the national indicators is also based on this metric. It is appropriate that the bill now strengthens these reporting duties through Amendment 24, and also that it ensures that measures to reduce these are included in the scope of climate change plans through Amendment 34. We must also remember that international practice, including under the Paris Agreement, is to report emissions on a territorial basis, in part because this avoids risks around double counting. Reducing territorial emissions, those from sources located here in Scotland, does need to remain the main focus of our target framework and efforts. The present amendments strike a sensible balance between these considerations, strengthening the complementary role for carbon footprint reporting without jeopardising the necessary focus on reducing emissions at source.
And Mark Russell, does Mark Russell wish to add anything by way of winding up? No. In that case, we'll move to the vote. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We turn now to Group 8, Land Use Strategy, and can I call Amendment 25 in the name of Claudia Beamish, grouped with Amendment 27. Claudia Beamish to move Amendment 25 and to speak to both amendments.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My two amendments in this group are designed to better align our land use strategy with climate change action. And I'm pleased that they have the support of a number of NGOs, including WWF Scotland, Scottish Land and Estates, National Farmers Union Scotland and Nourish. Recognising the key role that land use plays in climate mitigation and adaptation was a key part of the 2009 Act. But we've still seen little progress on policy delivery, no reporting since 2016, and, in our view, under-resourcing. This government has not taken the land use principles and underpinning the planning seriously enough. It was welcomed that in the programme of government, however, for this year, there was a commitment to developing proposals for implementing land use partnerships and frameworks, establishing partnerships by 2021 and tasking partnerships to create frameworks by 2023. These amendments seek to support these commitments, and I would be confused if the Scottish Government today does not support our amendments. Amendment 25 seeks to strengthen the mandate of the land use strategy to facilitate delivery of climate change targets, and Amendment 27 requires on ministers to set out proposals and policies for the establishment and the support and resourcing of regional land use partnerships and frameworks in the climate change plan itself. Regional land use partnerships and frameworks are key for identifying land use priorities in partnership with landowners and communities to bring multiple CO2 benefits with targeted public spending to support delivery. An appropriate land use strategy would support climate action and the transition to a carbon-positive rural landscape, as well as developing its important role in carbon sequestration, as highlighted by the UK Committee on Climate Change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
The programme for government commits us to establishing regional land use partnerships and frameworks by 2023. The present amendments are broadly in line with those commitments, and I'm content to accept them. The development of regional land use partnerships and frameworks is likely to be complicated, and that is reflected in the phased approach set out in the programme for government. It is important that we maintain that phased approach to ensure that we get this right, so that regional partnerships and frameworks are as effective as possible in contributing to tackling climate change. I'm content that Amendment 27 provides a reasonable way to ensure that progress on delivering these commitments is reflected in future climate change plans. On Amendment 25, in relation to annual reporting on progress to the land use strategy, I do have some concerns that such reporting may prove to be duplicative of what will be set out in any case in the monitoring reports on the climate change plan. Nonetheless, I can recognise the desire for regular reporting on the land use strategy in its own right, and I am prepared to support the amendment on that basis.
Thank you very much. And I call Claudia Beamish to wind up.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a long time in the coming. I'm delighted that the Cabinet Secretary is supporting these amendments, and I hope that across the chamber that this will be the case as well, because as we go forward with our land use strategies and our land use regional partnerships, it is vital that climate change is at the heart of these, and to have it on the face of the bill is really significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Turning to Group 9, timing of first climate change plan and monitoring report. Can I call Amendment 26 in the name of Mark Ruskell, grouped with Amendment 13. Mark Ruskell to move this amendment and to speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yes, I'm pleased to move this amendment. The last few months of this climate emergency has seen everybody, including the Greens, reassess whether our proposals are fit for delivering an unprecedented rate of change. And the amendments that have already been passed today lay down fresh challenges. A revised climate plan is needed. A tweak here and there to a revised plan won't cut it. This has to be a priority for government to deliver a fresh plan with fresh ambition in the next 6 months.
Thank you. I call Maurice Golden.
No, Cabinet Secretary first.
No, beg pardon. Sorry, Mr Golden. Before that, because I'm going to call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 13 and the other amendments in this group.
I will first respond, if I may, to Mark Ruskell's Amendment 26, which I was very disappointed to see lodged again after the discussions in committee at stage 2. The First Minister has made a very clear commitment in line with what the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee called for in its Stage 2 report to update the current climate change plan within 6 months of royal assent. Amendment 26 would instead require an entire new climate change plan process to be fully completed within 6 months. This is a significantly different proposition to the committee's recommendation and is frankly not just unreasonable but flat out impossible. There are extensive statutory requirements governing a full plan process. A draft version of the plan will need to be laid and scrutinised by Parliament within the proposed 6-month window. Amendments agreed at stage 2 in response to the committee's recommendations will mean that at least 4 of those months must be occupied by parliamentary scrutiny. This would leave the government with less than 2 months to design, prepare and consult on the plan, which is clearly untenable, particularly given the additional elements to the process that were amended into the bill at stage 2. For example, the bill requires the CCC's views to be sought on draft plans. Clearly, a reasonable amount of time needs to be given to the CCC to do that, and the government would want to consider the CCC's advice before laying the plan in Parliament. If we allow a month for that process, we are then in a position where the draft plan has to be produced, consulted on and all statutory assessments completed in just 1 month. This Parliament agreed to the Environment Assessment Act in 2005. That Act requires government to conduct strategic environmental assessments of plans and programmes likely to have significant environmental effects. It would not be possible to meet both that statutory requirement and a statutory requirement to finalise a new climate change plan, including parliamentary scrutiny of 4 months within a 6-month period. There is a global climate emergency, and what is needed in response is meaningful, swift action. The current climate change plan was published just over 18 months ago, following a process of parliamentary scrutiny. An updated plan is what the committee called for and what both the First Minister and myself have made clear commitments to delivering. Delivering an update within 6 months would be so challenging, but we are committed to doing so. Mark Ruskell's amendment isn't practicable or reasonable, and I strongly urge members to reject Amendment 26. In contrast, Amendment 13 in my name represents a pragmatic adjustment to the timing of future climate change plan monitoring reports in light of the commitment to update the current climate change plan within 6 months. The bill places annual reporting on a statutory footing. As recommended by the committee, the timing of these reports has now been moved to fall before summer recess each year. Our commitment to updating the current plan within 6 months of royal assent means that this can be expected in late spring next year. It would not make sense for there to be a requirement to lay a set of monitoring reports at the same time as we lay the updated plan, and to avoid that scenario, this amendment means that the first set of monitoring reports under the bill arrangements will be required in May 2021. This does not mean that no monitoring of the current climate change plan will occur until 2021. Building from the first plan monitoring report in October 2018, I can today confirm that we will publish a second annual report later this autumn. The monitoring information in that report will then help to inform the process of updating the plan itself.
Thank you very much. I call Maurice Golden to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We will be supporting Amendment 13 today. However, I appreciate Mark Ruskell's intention behind the amendment for a new climate change plan. On these benches, we agree that there should be a new climate change plan. There is a requirement for us to set out and chart our progress towards these new targets that we have agreed today. However, I think the timescales associated with of 6 months is just too stretching. And while I'm sure as opposition we want to put as much pressure on the Scottish Government as we possibly can, we also want to be fair and reasonable, and I feel that this amendment does not make and meet that test.
I call Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Anything new that should come forward in relation to the climate emergency in the climate change plan can, in fact, be put into an updated plan with the agreement of the committee agreement and with the agreement of the Parliament. So on reflection on what the Cabinet Secretary has said today, on Mark Ruskell's Amendment 26, we will actually abstain, and we will support the Cabinet Secretary's Amendment 13, if I have understood right, that the Cabinet Secretary is saying that there will be an updated plan within 6 months. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms Beamish. And I call on Mark Ruskell to wind up in this group.
Yes, thank you. I welcome the clarification from the Cabinet Secretary there about the government's plans for the process. We have to ensure that this revision to the climate plan is meaningful and that there is enough time and enough involvement from committees to actually scrutinise what comes out of this. We're making big changes here today with this climate bill. There will be big implications coming out of that. I welcome the support from opposition parties for the intention of this amendment, but I'll reflect on the contribution of the Cabinet Secretary and the reassurances that she gives and not press this amendment.
So, amendment, you're not pressing, no. So, Amendment 26 is not being pressed. So, can I ask the Chamber, does the member have permission to withdraw Amendment 26? We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 27 in the name of Claudia Beamish? This was debated earlier. Claudia Beamish to move.
Moved.
Thank you. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on Amendment 27. This will be a 1-minute division, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 27 in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes, 92. There were no votes against. There were 27 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. So the amendment is therefore agreed. The amendment is therefore agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 10, Climate Change Plan Proposals and Policies. And can I call Amendment 28 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 28 and to speak to all the amendments in this group.
Presiding Officer, there is a frustration amongst opposition parties in this Parliament. For years now, we have continually highlighted what we see as poor ambition on climate change, especially in the areas of housing and farming. Stronger action, as called on by the UK Climate Change Committee, should have been embedded into the climate change plan. But it wasn't, and so we needed to take action inside this legislation. Now, if I could start with the amendments on farming, which we all accept in this group. It's clear that while countries like France have forged ahead, creating ambitious agroecology action plans to cut emissions, restoring biodiversity and supporting farm businesses, in Scotland we remain stuck in preserving the status quo. We know how to change. We have excellent, if underfunded, research institutes. We can restore our soil while integrating trees onto farm systems, and we can expand organic production. We can design advice and financial support to drive the farming transition, while recognising the whole contribution that farm holdings can make to the nation's carbon balance sheet. On housing, drafty cold homes are dragging down our efforts to cut household emissions, and it needs a fresh focus alongside a determination to end the disgrace of fuel poverty. A tolerable standard of at least EPCC must be the norm for the vast majority of households in Scotland. We can learn from mass retrofit approaches across Europe, as well as the targeted approaches to helping hard-to-heat properties access advice and financial support. We must also be pioneering and look to new frontiers in preserving and locking up carbon. On this day today, that the IPCC has launched its new report on the oceans, I'm demanding that future climate plans recognise and support these ecosystems in their role as carbon sinks, as well as their ability to help us adapt to extreme weather. Kelp has never been more important, Presiding Officer. And finally, we need clarity from the government on their policies for fossil fuel extraction, including unconventional oil and gas. Now, there's been a welcome change in tone from the First Minister, while we still await a legally watertight fracking ban to be delivered. The government's policies on fossil fuels cannot exist in a separate silo away from these climate plans. The need for transition has to be addressed in the heart of these climate plans, regardless of the level of ambition. So, Presiding Officer, across a range of policy areas, I move amendments 28, 29 and 30 in this group.
Thank you very much, Mr Ruskell. And I call on Maurice Golden to speak to Amendment 31 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If you permit me, I'll start off with Amendment 33, the Agricultural Modernisation Fund. And this would introduce a requirement for Scottish ministers to set out the proposals and policies in the climate change plan for such a fund to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on Scottish farms. This year's programme for government set out the Scottish Government's plans to consider funding in the budget as part of a new agricultural transformation programme. My amendment would ensure that policies and proposals for any future agricultural modernisation fund are considered in the next climate change plan. Taking forward policies and proposals for funding to support climate-friendly farming practices could help contribute to on-farm sequestration and emissions reductions. At present, funding is not available to support farmers with often prohibitive upfront costs associated with reducing emissions from agriculture. On Amendment 31, this seeks to introduce a requirement for Scottish ministers to set out their proposals and policies for a whole farm approach to emissions accounting on Scottish farms in the climate change plan. This amendment would require the climate change plan set out the Scottish Minister's proposals and policies regarding the establishment of a whole farm approach to emissions accounting on Scottish farms and the reduction of Scottish whole farm greenhouse gas emissions through the use of, amongst others, research, knowledge transfer and advice and circular economy initiatives. I'm pleased to have cross-party support for this amendment. However, I will not be supporting amendments 31A, 31B, which were tabled as amendments to my Amendment 31, because I believe that these will make the provision initially inserted into the bill by my amendment to become overly prescriptive. Amendment 32 seeks to introduce a requirement for Scottish ministers to set out their proposals and policies on the potential for capture and storage of carbon when designated marine protection areas in the climate change plan. This amendment would encourage the Scottish Government to take account of the potential for carbon sequestration alongside biodiversity concerns when designated marine protected areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Claudia Beamish to speak to Amendment 31A and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If I may, I will start with Mark Ruskell's Amendment 28. which we will be supporting, and I would stress that it will oblige discussion on the future of our fossil fuel industry and where that's going, and that's a discussion that needs to be had across this Parliament in relation to the climate emergency and the just transition, and also highlights the onshore fracking position that the Parliament holds as I speak. In terms of Mark Ruskell's Amendment 29, research is needed to build on what we have already and mirror the peatland research journey to action. And so we support this because in the climate change plan, we have somewhat teetered around real support for the marine ecosystems and blue carbon. And I think this should be a priority and there should be more research into this. In terms of Mark Ruskell's Amendment 30, we're really positive about the possibilities for housing in looking at reducing climate change emissions, but also the multiple benefits that come to communities across Scotland and particularly often rural communities in fuel poverty, which will lead to a better quality of life and support the UN right to a home, which in Scotland, of course, should be a warm home. Maurice Golden and Mark Ruskell, building on Mark Ruskell's Stage 2 amendment on whole farm commitments, and also the work by some colleagues in the committee, such as John Scott, who I pay my good wishes to today as well, and Finlay Carson. This is a really important amendment because agriculture is one of the heaviest and somewhat intractable emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that this amendment would bring cause for optimism in clarifying something quite robust about a whole range of issues in relation to the way forward. And I think it's very valuable that these are set out and will help with a just transition for the land use sector and agriculture, including support and advice mechanisms. In terms of my own amendments 31A and 31B, these are additions to Maurice Golden and Mark Ruskell's Amendment 31, and they add carbon sequestration and agroforestry onto the list of areas by which Scottish farms can reduce whole farm greenhouse gas emissions. I've already said that we'll support Amendment 31 as a worthwhile addition to the plan, giving a more rounded approach to understanding farm emissions and how ministers will support farmers in the climate emergency. So I am really disappointed. Yes.
Mike Rumbles.
Member for giving way. I'm genuinely not clear what her Amendment 31A about carbon sequestration to whole farms would actually entail. Could she be a little bit more specific of what she's actually advocating here?
Claudia Beamish.
I thank Mike Rumbles for that intervention. What I'm advocating is that up until now, it's often been the case that farmers have been doing work on carbon sequestration on peatlands, and the work hasn't been recognised and quite often hasn't been supported. So it's very important that in my view, that we put this into the amendment so that that recognition is there. And I do find it, to go on from there, disappointing that, if I understand it right, that Maurice Golden isn't going to support either of my amendments, either on peatland restoration or on agroforestry, because I think these are ways forward which farmers can really contribute through, and also they can bring great benefits to farmers themselves. You know, the agroforestry, they're not over-prescriptive in my view. They are important methods of land management, and they deserve attention and should be on the face of the bill. And I think that it will bring further discussion by putting them onto the face of the bill into the common understanding of options for greener farming and working with nature. I think ways of combining woodlands, tree planting and hedging for growing or grazing in agroforestry and seasonal shade and shelter, as well as riparian planting to avoid erosion, are only two or three examples of the value that agroforestry can bring. And I think this should be at the heart of this amendment in the climate emergency. And I would stress also that with the great deal of work that's been done by Nourish, these two amendments have been supported as strengthening additions to Amendment 31. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The amendments in this grouping all seek to constrain the content of future climate change plans to set out policies and proposals on specific matters. Parliament already has substantial input into the design of plans through scrutiny of a draft version. So the group of amendments does run the risk of overly prescribing a set of certain policy areas. It will run the risk of restricting the process for plan preparation and also runs a danger of introducing a hierarchy of policy options, with those chosen now to be on the face of the Act taking precedence over all others. And these do remain concerns. Nevertheless, I've reflected on the decisions made by the committee at stage 2 and the ongoing desire to further such amendments. As such, I've looked closely at each of today's amendments with a view to supporting these wherever possible. I can accept Amendment 28 to require that our future climate change plans should include our policies on onshore and offshore oil and gas. I am sympathetic to both of the amendments on blue carbon. Our oceans are vital in mitigating climate change, and Parliament's interest in the marine environment is welcomed. However, I don't think it would be sensible for both of these to be agreed. I'm of the view that Maurice Golden's Amendment 32 better reflects the status of the emerging and evolving evidence base around these matters than Mark Ruskell's Amendment 29. In particular, I ask colleagues to remember that international scientific guidelines for the measurement of carbon storage in marine environments do not yet support this being included in national greenhouse gas inventories.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking that intervention. In terms of Maurice Golden's Amendment 32, my understanding is that there's a vital focus of planning and monitoring for MPAs in that amendment, whereas Mark Ruskell's amendment is more widely looks at and highlights the whole marine environment and the opportunities there. So that's why Scottish Labour today will be supporting both of them.
In the process of explaining why I think the Maurice Golden amendment actually suits the situation better at the moment, simply because of that international scientific guidelines not actually being there for the measurement. And I'm glad that Claudia Beamish mentioned the particular reference to marine protected areas in Amendment 25, because actually that is welcome. If the MPA network needs to be adapted in the future, then it is right that the potential sequestration of carbon is a material consideration in site selection, designation and management. I would urge members to support Amendment 32 and reject Amendment 29. I can accept Amendment 30 to set out measures in our climate change plans linking to achieving EPCC for a majority of homes by the end of the plan period where practical. The CCC has been clear that the Scottish Government has already put forward a strong plan for creating more energy efficient homes. We've also accepted the committee's recommendation on heat decarbonisation and will publish a heat decarbonisation policy statement in summer 2020. And we are currently developing our plan to ensure any new build homes consented from 2024 are required to use renewable or low carbon heat. The Scottish Government's policy position is that by 2040 our buildings will be warmer, greener and more efficient, and we will continue our strong delivery approach towards achieving these goals as a key part of achieving net zero emissions by 2045 across Scotland's economy as a whole. However, do let me be clear that all those who support this amendment must also support any necessary measures in future to compel homeowners to invest in the energy efficiency of their homes. I can also accept Amendment 31, including Amendments 31A and 31B on the establishment of a whole farm approach to emissions accounting. We're all eager to give proper recognition and credit to Scotland's farmers and land managers for the wide range of activities they undertake to help tackle climate change. The Government is already undertaking work to develop a complementary reporting system of emissions on a whole farm basis. The present amendment will mean that such reporting only happens every 5 years with each new climate change plan. I'm not sure if this is quite what stakeholders are looking for. The Government would look to report rather more frequently than that. Furthermore, as discussed at stage 2, members must understand that any such complementary accounting scheme cannot replace the greenhouse gas inventory, which is determined by international classifications. Finally, in this group, I can also accept Maurice Golden's Amendment 33 on an agricultural modernisation fund. While there is a slight danger this may prove too prescriptive in a bill requiring reporting to continue until 2045, nonetheless, we are content to factor this into the development of our existing commitment to a long-term agricultural transformation programme, which was set out in the programme for government.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Mark Ruskell to wind up in this group.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I mean, I'm sensing a good degree of consensus on many of those areas. And just to reassure the Cabinet Secretary and her officials, this isn't about constraining the content of climate change plans. This is about filling the very obvious gaps that have been sitting there for years, which committee has reflected on as well, and which, we're concerned that the government has not filled. I mean, in terms of the amendments on agriculture, I mean, I think, there has been a good degree of consensus, particularly around the fact that our farms are actually the solution to climate change. We often look at it in terms of a problem, and there are emissions problems on farms, but there's also fantastic opportunities around carbon sequestration. So taking a whole farm approach to the way that we measure carbon accounting, I think, is very important. And, I think, we missed the contribution of John Scott, who's obviously not here today. John's contribution committee on this issue has been very strong. In terms of the blue carbon issues and Maurice Golden's amendment, I am concerned, as an alternative to mine, that it focuses entirely on MPAs and the MPA designation process. Our kelp forests, our blue carbon resources exist across the coast of Scotland in our seas. They're not just restricted to MPAs. So I would have concerns about supporting that amendment on its own. If it was in combination with a broader strategic approach, as I'm proposing through my amendment, I would accept it, but not on its own. Claudia Beamish is nodding away as well. The definition of that is far too constrained. Oil and gas. I think it's significant that both the Labour Party and the SNP support this. They support the start of a discussion of oil and gas in the context of climate change, in the climate change plan. That's not to, build policies at this point into that climate change plan for the future, but it is to acknowledge that we need to start somewhere with this discussion. It is about just transition. It is about the future of that industry and taking communities with us in that transition. And I welcome that. I welcome that very much so. And in terms of housing, yes, I take on board the Cabinet Secretary's point there. There is a wider issue now. If we're going to be serious about delivering EPCC, there's a wider issue about budget, which of course will concern all parties in this chamber.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. So the question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division on Amendment 28. This will be a 1-minute division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 28 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 93, no 27. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. Can I call amendment 29 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 29 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. This will be a 30-second vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 29 in the name of Mark Ruskell is yes 34, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 6 in the name of Claudia Beamish? This was debated earlier in Group 3. Claudia Beamish to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 30 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move.
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 31 in the name of Maurice Golden? Just to move the amendment, Mr. Golden.
Moved.
Thank you. And I call amendment 31A in the name of Claudia Beamish. Claudia Beamish to move.
Move, Presiding Officer.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 31A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. On 31A, members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 31A in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes 93, no 28. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. Can I call amendment 31B in the name of Claudia Beamish? Claudia Beamish to move.
Move, Presiding
That is
Officer.
moved. The question is that amendment 31B be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. Amendment 31B. The result of the vote on amendment number 31B in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes 93, no 28. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. So Maurice Golden to press or withdraw amendment 31 as amended.
Press.
Press. The question is that amendment 31 as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 32 in the name of Maurice Golden? Already debated. Maurice Golden to move amendment 32.
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that amendment 32 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed.
No.
Is that a no there? There's a no. Sorry, I beg pardon. There's a no on amendment 32. We'll move to a vote on amendment 32 and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 32 in the name of Maurice Golden is yes 114, no 7. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore agreed. Now can I call Amendment 33 in the name of Maurice Golden? Maurice Golden to move.
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 33 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 34 in the name of Mark Ruskell. Mark Ruskell to move. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We turn now to Group 11, Just Transition Principles. Can I call Amendment 35 in the name of Claudia Beamish, grouped with Amendments 7, 8, 36 and 37. Claudia Beamish to move Amendment 36 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have 4 amendments in this group designed to embed the Just Transition into the core of this bill, and I will speak to them shortly. In Scottish Labour's opinion, this bill has a glaring oversight in the exclusion of the Statutory Just Transition Commission. We embark on a pathway to reach net zero emissions by 2045 at the latest, a huge positive shift, but one that will require a change in all areas of life, from the individual, for the worker, for communities, for businesses, across all sectors. This shift must benefit from the guidance of those in these industries, of those with relevant experience and expertise, and these questions of justice must be re-asked multiple times throughout this shift and beyond. It is in Scottish Labour's view nonsensical that the Scottish Government thinks that their Commission, with respect to its membership, can provide the answers within 3 years. It is worrying that the Scottish Government won't protect its Commission with legislation to shield it from any future government or ministerial change when it is so important to so many. And it is baffling that the Cabinet Secretary has disregarded it as too heavyweight and cumbersome and time-consuming when we are looking at such a long-term issue in the climate emergency. It is ultimately disappointing that the Scottish Government refused to give this bill a financial resolution, therefore limiting the spend so significantly, despite its warm words about a climate emergency. This has meant I have been unable to bring my proposals for a statutory commission to a vote at stage 3. I see the Scottish Government's rejection of a statutory commission as a fundamental misunderstanding of the concerns of workers, communities and businesses. However, I will now move on to the amendments I have been able to submit within the confines of the bill's somewhat limited scope in this area. Amendment 8 includes further information relevant to the just transition within the climate change plans, requiring ministers to set out how the policies will affect different regions of Scotland and the employment of those in regions and sectors of the economy. It also requires ministers to set out how they will support the workforce, employers and communities in these sectors and regions. Amendment 7 is a minor consequential to this. Amendment 35 includes specific reference to the Just Transition principles in the preparation of the plan, which is the section of the bill in which the consideration of the principles will be most significant. Setting the domestic policies to deliver these targets must have the influence of social justice. And Amendment 37 adds trade unions to those persons with which the Scottish ministers must develop and maintain social consensus through engagement. The existing list included workers, communities, non-governmental organisations, representatives of the interests of business and industry, and appropriate others. The Just Transition movement was born from the trade unions, and so this is a glaring omission, and I hope members will support this today and the other amendments in the group. These 4 amendments are important additions, and I'm glad to see they've received the backing of a number of NGOs, in particular also NFUS, as securing a just transition will be so important for farmers, who have a potential greater role to play in solving the climate challenges as custodians of our land in one of the heaviest emitters, that being agriculture. I know, though, that there will be many today who are disappointed, finally, that the Just Transition Commission cannot be put on a statutory footing, not least the Just Transition Partnership of NGOs and unions and the STUC itself, who have done so much work to put this on a long-term, properly resourced statutory footing for the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beamish. I call Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 36 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you. I've been very pleased to work with Claudia Beamish at Stage 2 in our attempts to try and embed the Just Transition principles into the bill and establish a statutory commission. And I share a frustration, and I will be returning to that in the debate that we're going to have after the Stage 3 amendment phase. But the amendments in this group that have been agreed with government go a little way to ensuring that Just Transition is recognised in the climate plans. My own amendment in this group ensures that the reporting must also spell out how communities, workers and employers are being assisted in that transition. It's a small improvement. It's a small improvement, but hopefully a step towards a much wider approach to transition and the work needed on the ground to plan and progress the changes that are profound but also just.
Thank you. And I call Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. I talked earlier, Presiding Officer, about the importance of taking people with us as we seek to make the changes that are necessary in delivering our climate change ambitions. This is true in relation to the targets we set. It underpins the case for establishing a citizens' assembly, and it's very much central to the concept of ensuring a just transition, achieving net zero emissions by 2045, and the interim target we've now set for 2030 will be enormously challenging. It will require significant changes in behaviour, practice and the way in which our overall economy functions. Recognising this and finding ways of mitigating the impacts where possible, allowing those directly affected an opportunity to shape the way in which that change happens will be essential. The amendments, I think, in this group are useful in that respect, further fleshing out what a just transition should look like. I'm particularly pleased to see Amendment 8 in Claudia Beamish's name, which I think seeks to break down this process to a more regional and sectoral level, recognising that the effect of those changes will not be felt uniformly across the board. I absolutely share Claudia Beamish and Mark Russell's frustration about the failure to make progress in embedding the Just Transition Commission on a statutory footing. I look forward to hearing what the Cabinet Secretary has to say, but confirm Scottish Liberal Democrats are generally supportive of the intention that lies behind the amendments in this group. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
I was anticipating actually speaking to the amendments that have been lodged, Presiding Officer. The amendments in this group seek to further strengthen the emphasis on a just transition approach at the heart of climate change plans, and I'm grateful to Claudia Beamish and Mark Ruskell for constructive engagement with the Government over the summer to adapt their Stage 2 amendments on these matters into a form that will better fit with the wider bill framework. The present amendments build usefully from the Government's amendments at Stage 2, which have added a set of just transition principles to the bill, as matters that ministers must have regard to when preparing climate change plans. Those plans must also then set out how the principles have been taken into account. The principles outline the importance of taking action to reduce Scottish emissions in a way which supports environmentally and socially sustainable jobs, supports low-carbon investment in infrastructure, develops and maintains social consensus through engagement with workers, communities, non-governmental organisations, representatives of the interests of business and industry and others, creates decent, fair and high-value work in a way which does not negatively affect the current workforce and overall economy, and contributes to resource-efficient and sustainable economic approaches which help address inequality and poverty. Amendment 37 adds trade unions to the bodies that must be engaged as part of these principles. This would have been the case anyway, and I'm happy to support the change on the face of the bill. Amendment 8 will ensure that existing assessments of the impacts of climate change plans on sectors of the economy will include regional dimensions and employment in particular. And Amendment 8 also ensures that plans must also include policies and proposals to support workforces, employers and communities through the transition to net zero emissions. Amendment 36 ensures that such measures are also within the scope of the sector-by-sector annual monitoring reports on progress to delivering the plan. And all of these represent sound additions to the statutory framework. I would, however, urge Claudia Beamish not to press her Amendment 35. This seeks to require the specific element of the plan relating to assessing impacts on the economy to be prepared with reference to the Just Transition principles. My objection to this amendment is purely technical, as I hope that I've been clear that I see the Just Transition principles as firmly underpinning the climate change plan. However, the bill as it stands already requires that ministers take into account the Just Transition principles when preparing all aspects of climate change plans. and to set out how they have done so. It is these duties which give substance to the principles. As such, the proposed amendment would be largely duplicative of the existing provisions and therefore not good legal practice. So I would encourage Claudia Beamish to not press Amendment 35 for these strong technical reasons. If she does continue to do so, then I will oppose it. In respect of the amendment that isn't here, putting a Just Transition Commission into a statutory framework, could I remind everybody in this chamber that there is a Just Transition Commission. It has been working hard over the last year and it will continue to work hard, and I look forward to their report when it comes.
Thank you, and I call on Claudia Beamish to wind up in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I've listened with care to what the Cabinet Secretary has said. However, I am disappointed that she hasn't given further explanation of why a long-term statutory, properly resourced Just Transition Commission is not something that the Scottish Government can support, because net zero is going to be sometime in the coming in the climate emergency. And Mark Ruskell and Liam MacArthur have also highlighted this. And I really am perplexed and bewildered as to why she says this. Perhaps the Scottish Government might reconsider when this present Commission actually gives its report, because at that point I understand it won't be necessary to have primary legislation in order to have a Just Transition Commission in law. And this is what is needed to have a robust and prioritised commission as we move in the climate emergency to a better way of working and a better way of life for workers and communities, and indeed what Liam MacArthur says about the regions. However, we do have the Just Transition principles more clearly laid out in the bill, and I appreciate the work that we've done over the summer with the Cabinet Secretary on that. I will, though, be pressing 35 and make no apology for that, because I think that it's very important that the Just Transition principles are enshrined, particularly in relation to the climate change plan, and I haven't been convinced by what the Cabinet Secretary said on that. So a Just Transition must be at the heart of our climate change bill and our plans for the future, and all policies must be assessed against the effects that the climate change plans going forward have on our communities and on workers and on, indeed, individuals, particularly those on lower incomes. So I'm very glad that there is considerable support for these across the chamber today. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 7 in the name of Claudia Beamish. Claudia Beamish to move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 8, Claudia Beamish to move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 9, Claudia Beamish to move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 10, Claudia Beamish to move.
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 11, Claudia Beamish to move.
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. Can I call Amendment 12, Claudia Beamish to move?
Move.
That is moved. The question is that Claudia... Sorry, the question is... yes, sorry, yeah. Can I call Amendment 12A in the name of Claudia Beamish?
Moved.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 12A be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. And we're not agreed. This is the first vote after a division, so after a group, so it's a 1 minute debate, a 1 minute vote, and members may cast their votes now. It's Amendment 12A. The result of the vote on amendment number 12A in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes 27, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. So the question is that amendment 12 be agreed.
Press will withdraw amendment 12.
Yes. Yes, he's already pressed it. Is amendment 12 to be agreed? Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Can I call amendment 36 in the name of Mark Ruskell? Mark Ruskell to move? Moved. That is moved. The question is that amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 13 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary? Already moved. Thank you. Already debated amendment. The question is that amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 37 in the name of Claudia Beamish? Claudia Beamish to move? Moved. That is moved. The question is that amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call amendment 14 in the name of Claudia Beamish? Claudia Beamish to move? Moved. That is moved. Can I call amendment 14A in the name of Claudia Beamish? Claudia Beamish to move? Moved. So the first question is that amendment 14A be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. This will be a 30-second division on amendment 14A. Members may vote now. The result. Just changing. The result of the vote on amendment number 14A in the name of Claudia Beamish is yes 27, no 92. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The question is that amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Now we turn to our final group, Group 12, Impact of Infrastructure Investment on Emissions. Can I call amendment 15 in the name of Claudia Beamish in a group on its own? Claudia Beamish to speak to and move the amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 15 relates to the Scottish Government's infrastructure investment plans, as has emerged thanks to discussion between myself, Mark Ruskell and the Cabinet Secretary following our amendments at stage 2. Infrastructure investments made by the public purse need to be fit for the future and for the public good. In the context of the climate emergency, this public good must be in alignment with emissions reductions efforts. This amendment goes some way to achieving that by requiring ministers to set out an assessment of how its infrastructure investment plan will contribute to our targets. I'm pleased that this works in conjunction with my amendments passed in the Planning Act, which required an assessment of the life cycle of emissions of major developments, giving a much clearer picture of the emissions associated in construction, usage, and, I stress, decommissioning. There is further work to be done in ensuring the future-proofing of our public infrastructure, but I hope members will support this amendment to give a better understanding, at least, of the strategic and financial decisions made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I call Mark Ruskell?
Thanks. Financial budgeting is an area of this bill where I'd hoped we could have made greater progress by now. At stage 2, we did discuss the imperative of setting a clear target to shift infrastructure spend from high carbon to low carbon, to lock out rather than to lock in emissions for decades to come. Sadly, in this bill, we're no further forward, although I do welcome the fact that the government are commissioning work to flesh out a methodology for assessing high to low carbon infrastructure projects, and, crucially, the emissions that are generated from the use of that infrastructure. This amendment to help reveal the infrastructure investment plan's climate impact is a welcome baby step forward, but there's still much to do in this area.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell, and I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, I'm content to support Amendment 15 as a pragmatic measure to improve reporting arrangements around how Scottish budgets are supporting emissions reductions. However, this amendment should also be seen as fitting into a wider body of work on these important matters. The Scottish Government has placed climate change at the heart of the current programme for government, and it will likewise be central to the upcoming spending review and budget. There were a range of Stage 2 amendments lodged regarding the relationship between budget information and climate change action. I've met with Green and Labour MSPs over the summer to discuss these matters where it is recognised that there is scope for improvement. As a result of these discussions, the Finance Secretary and myself have offered a review of climate change information in the budget. Such a review will necessarily take some time in order to be effective, but we expect it to be able to inform the 2020-2021 budget. I've also offered to commission programmes of research to better understand how capital expenditure can be assessed in terms of emissions impacts and how information on the emissions impacts of all relevant policies is currently being identified and communicated through existing statutory impact assessment processes. These review and research programmes will help identify steps to deliver improvements in cross-portfolio processes and transparency. This first step, gathering and reviewing evidence, is the right one. There are real and very challenging issues of methodology that need to be resolved before we can determine the best reporting requirements. In the meantime, I'm content to support the present amendment on the emissions impacts of the Scottish Government's infrastructure investment plans. This recognises the particular importance of strategic capital investment decisions for Scotland's journey to net zero emissions, but does so in a way which is not overly prescriptive given the current uncertainties around methodologies for assessing these impacts.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And Claudia Beamish to wind up and to press or withdraw this amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to press the amendment, and I do welcome the comments by Mark Ruskell that we haven't gone far enough. However, I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's comments and commitment to the review to inform the budget and also the further assessment review. The two reviews that she's highlighted, I'm sure, will take us well forward for future budgets. And as she highlights, the strategic capital investment issues are profoundly important if we are to move forward in the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 16? Claudia Beamish to move.
Move,
that is moved. The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. That's agreed, and that ends consideration of amendments. Now, before we move on, I've got a determination to make, which is that at this point in proceedings, I'm required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is, whether it modifies the electoral system or franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In my opinion, in this case, it does not. Therefore, it does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. Now, I had hoped we were well ahead of time, but we've actually lost time again. So but I'm going to take a short suspension. So if I can suspend maybe for 8 minutes, as long as we're back here before 10 past. A short suspension.
are just about to start, so can I just make sure front bench are all in their places? Thank you. The next item of business is a stage 3 debate on motion 19025 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham on the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Target Scotland Bill. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Rosanna Cunningham to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, 7 minutes or thereabouts, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We're 10 years from the 2009 Climate Change Act. And I should say that Stuart Stevenson, who was then the minister who took the legislation through in 2009, has reminded me that stage 3 in that act took morning and afternoon. So I hope people are pleased that this time around it's been considerably slimmer in terms of management. That act established Scotland as a world leader in tackling climate change, and we continue to be a world leader because of the effective and rigorous framework it created. Scotland is still the only country in the world to set legally binding annual targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We were the first country to include a fair share of the emissions from international aviation and shipping in our targets. Since 2009, 3 climate change plans have been brought forward, with some annual targets being met and some missed. But crucially, Scotland's emissions are now down by 47% since the 1990 baseline. We're already almost halfway to reaching net zero emissions, and equally importantly, this progress has been achieved while growing the economy, increasing employment and productivity. The bill makes the Act stronger and more transparent, but crucially, it increases the ambition of Scotland's targets. Last year's special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on global warming of 1.5 degrees made clear that the world is now facing a climate emergency. And this is recognised by not only the scientists, but also the larger numbers of citizens here in Scotland and across the world that have taken to the streets to demand that more action and greater ambition be the result. In light of the IPCC's report, the Scottish Government commissioned expert advice on targets from the independent advisory body mandated by this Parliament. The Committee on Climate Change's advice recommended that Scotland should set 2045 as the target year to reach net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases. It also recommended that we increase our interim targets for 2030 and 2040 to reductions of 70% and 90% respectively. The CCC advises that these targets represent the highest possible ambition called for under the Paris Agreement, and that they represent a fair contribution towards what is needed globally to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And I immediately lodged amendments at stage 2 to give effect to the CCC's recommendations. Today, we've committed to going even further and adopting a target of a 75% reduction in Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. I've already set out my reasons for this approach. It is clear that now is the time for even greater ambition in tackling the world's climate emergency, and that signals matter. I will also look forward to receiving further, more detailed advice from the CCC next year on the 2030 target. At stage 2, we accepted a large number of the recommendations made by the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee in its stage 1 and stage 2 reports, including directly linking Scotland's fair and safe emissions budget to the global temperature goal set out in the Paris Agreement, tightening the safeguards around any potential lowering of target levels in the future, clarifying and strengthening the role of the CCC in the climate change plan process, requiring that climate change plans include estimates of the costs and benefits of the policies to reduce emissions. Over the summer, we've worked with colleagues cross-party to bring back amendments from stage 2 for discussion today. And these include those that will embed sustainable development considerations throughout the Act and place climate justice at the heart of climate change plans, strengthen the reporting duties around consumption-based emissions, and ensure that the Scottish Government's strategic infrastructure investment plans are assessed against emissions targets. The Government has made every effort to accept opposition proposals wherever we have felt it possible to do so. The bill, if it is agreed this afternoon, will now set the framework and target pathway for Scotland's journey to net zero. This represents...
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. She says that the Government has tried to accept amendments wherever possible. But she has rejected the proposal for an 80% target for 2030. Can I remind her that in that 2009 debate, that longer debate, I put forward amendments for a 50% target for 2030 and 90% by 2050. I was told by the government at the time, falling back on the advice of the UK CCC, that those were unachievable and too ambitious to back. Given that we were right before, and the government's now accepted that it can go beyond that, is it not possible that we're right this time again?
Give your time back, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I hear what Patrick Harvey says. It is what I would understand and accept he will want to say. But when you're in government, you have to think about what actually, at the time you're passing the legislation, is going to be realistic and achievable. And that's what we've done. The bill, if it's agreed this afternoon, will now set the framework and target pathway for Scotland's journey to net zero. And this represents a vital step, but must be matched by actions to deliver on what are extremely challenging targets. The transition to net zero will require changes to virtually every aspect of everyday life for Scotland's people. This can and will only be achieved if it is a national endeavour. The Scottish Government's commitment is clear. Climate change lies at the heart of our programme for government, and we have committed, in line with the committee's recommendations, to updating our current climate change plan within 6 months of the bill receiving royal assent. We are looking across our full range of responsibilities to make sure we continue with the policies that are working and identify areas where we can go further, faster. I will return to some of the specific actions we're already taking in my closing remarks. Central to our approach is a just transition, one in which no one is left behind. To reflect this commitment clearly in law, the bill was amended at stage 2 to place a set of internationally recognised just transition principles on its face and at the heart of climate change plans. Amendments agreed today have strengthened these arrangements even further. Public engagement will be vital. Building from the big climate conversation over the summer, we've committed to a national forum on climate change, and we have today supported an amendment to mandate the establishment of a Citizens' Assembly. I would like to conclude by expressing my special thanks and gratitude to all the members of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee for their contributions to the bill process. And can I make a special mention of John Scott, who I know would wish to have been here today to see this bill through to the end, because he took a great interest in it. Presiding Officer, this bill maintains Scotland's position as the country with the most stringent framework of statutory climate change targets anywhere in the world. And I think we should sometimes remember that when we're discussing climate change. If agreed, it will mean that Scotland's contribution to climate change ends definitively within a generation. Today will then mark the start of the second half of Scotland's journey to net zero emissions. I move that the Parliament agrees that the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you very much. And I call Maurice Gold over the Conservatives. Mr Golden, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Scottish Conservatives are committed to tackling climate change and protecting our planet for future generations. We know that human activity has caused around 1 degree of global warming and that temperatures will continue to rise if we do not drastically cut our emissions. These increases in temperature will have a devastating impact on humanity. Today, a new IPCC report warns us that the Earth's oceans are already under severe strain from climate change. Our seas have become hotter, more acidic, and contain less oxygen and less fish because of human activity. The report warns that if emissions continue at their current rate, there will be enormous risks to food security, and coastal communities around the world will be in danger from sea level rise and tropical cyclones. Scotland will not escape unscathed. Our communities will face increased flood risks, putting our coastal towns, villages and homes at risk, and extreme weather will endanger our wildlife, flora and fauna. Scotland is performing well on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we should be proud of what we have achieved as a nation in almost halving our emissions since 1990. Large emission reductions, particularly across the energy and waste sectors, are welcome achievements. made possible by a range of public, private and third sector actions and a favourable policy landscape from both the UK and Scottish governments. However, our success so far hides a lack of progress in major areas, such as the housing sector, where emissions are only down 21%. Last year, we won cross-party support to enact stronger energy efficiency targets for homes by 2030 to help drive down emissions from our housing sector. This is an issue my colleague Alexander Burnett has worked hard to promote, and I was pleased to see that the Scottish Government listened to the will of the Scottish Parliament and pledged to bring forward a commitment to this in their programme for government this year. We were pleased to support a Green amendment from Mark Ruskell, which will ensure that the climate change plan sets out measures from improving the energy efficiency of housing across Scotland. We must continue to ensure that we are taking action that creates opportunities for individuals and businesses. As the opposition party to have released policy ideas in a comprehensive policy document, we have always been clear we want to see actions to limit global warming that provide a creation and sustainability of jobs, support for innovation and investment in cutting-edge technology. We have always supported this bill in principle and believe that many of the changes that have been made throughout the legislative process have strengthened the bill and made it better. Our amendments at Stage 3 seek to promote and support the transition to a low-carbon economy and encourage further action. We recognise the importance of supporting all sectors of the economy transition to a low-carbon economy. That is why I've lodged an amendment on the Agricultural Modernisation Fund, and I was pleased to see that gain cross-party support this afternoon. This fund will support investment in mitigation measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on Scottish farms. We want to make sure that farmers are supported as part of a transition to a low-carbon economy and are supported to produce better environmental and economic outcomes. We also recognise the importance of supporting emerging technologies, and so introduced an amendment that would require future climate change plans to set out proposals and policies regarding the consideration of carbon capture and storage when Scottish ministers designate marine protected areas. I was also pleased to see this gain support this afternoon. Development of this technology has the potential to create and sustain jobs across Scotland, particularly important in the North East. This bill and the achievement of the targets set in it will help Scotland meet its duty to protect present and future generations from climate change. However, it is important that these targets are achievable, so this bill does not become a missed opportunity. The Scottish Conservatives are pleased to be supporting this bill at decision time today, and we will continue to support actions that work towards achieving the targets set out in it.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things about a quiet debate is I can hear a conversation at the back, and I just suggest to members, go away and get a cup of tea and have your wee chat there, not let me eavesdrop. I now call Claudia Beamish to close for Labour. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour's vision for the Climate Change Act has, from the first, been about meeting ambition and also about it being just. It has been about confessing what we see before our eyes and responding honourably. The climate emergency is here. It is a terrible threat to millions of lives. The cost of ignoring it vastly outweighs the cost of tackling it head-on. And the transformational change required will deliver a better and fairer society if managed for the many and not the few. I add my utter admiration to the climate change strikers, those young people, and also to Extinction Rebellion, and to all those voices in the global chorus calling for us to do better. Who can dismiss a mandate for millions around the world and the indomitable Greta Thunberg, frustrated to tears, speaking at the UN this week? I'm so proud today to be in the Labour Party, the first major political party to set an ambition at a level anywhere near what is needed to happen at our national conference yesterday, accompanied by a raft of proposals fit for our future. Members of the SNP government have sometimes called me gung-ho a number of times. I dare them to use that line today with the thousands of eyes of climate strikers on us all, and that of the Global South. The fact is, their interim target was not enough, and the IPCC demanded rapid and transformational change in order to prevent irreversible damage. Already, children in Iceland have held a funeral at the site of the first glacier lost to climate change. Some irrevocable damage is already happening and affecting ecosystems and humans across the globe. And yet, the government's 70% target was only a few numbers off the target set 10 years ago in the 2009 Act. I'm proud this week that the Labour movement demonstrated the utmost commitment to taking on climate change, and Scottish Labour will now consult on our Scottish Labour position. Climate strikers, the Labour Party is listening, and in many ways this whole Parliament is listening. I'm also heartened that opposition parties today came together to go some way to ensuring this. I lodged my amendment of 75% reduction by 2030 with this very intention that consensus could be found and show this Parliament is serious and is listening. It will also send a signal to all, to innovators, to financiers, to those gathering research funding, to businesses and to communities and public bodies and individuals across Scotland and indeed, I hope, across the world, with Glasgow coming up next year as the COP here. Let's all commit today to going further as soon as we possibly can. The SNP government say that the pathway to net zero delivery isn't clear, but they also intentionally limited the scope and budget of this bill and denied the establishment of a statutory long-term Just Transition Commission specifically designed to guide that pathway ethically. This is a real lost opportunity for this bill. Knowing that the voices of those in the affected industries and communities and regions were front and centre would have been a comfort to those who feel uncertainty. And the government's refusal to give the bill a financial resolution, so limiting its budget, has denied the Just Transition Commission even to go to a vote. We will not have the answers to an equitable pathway by 2021, when our economy and society will be transitioning through the coming years. This is about getting union, business, worker and community input into an equitable transition for those in the oil and gas fields, for farmers, for transport workers, for those in every sector and every home and community on whatever incomes. Cabinet Secretary, these people would be grateful if you could make clear your reasons against the statutory and long-term Just Transition Commission. Is it because you're not willing to meet its cost? Is it because you think it would take too long to set up? These are issues that really should be addressed, and I hope at the end of the 2 years that is still to go for the present Just Transition Commission that these will be addressed and that we will move forward together and make it statutory. However, I am delighted that there was collaboration with government on securing more meaningful climate justice for the Global South. We now have the principle of climate justice in statute and duties set out to ensure that Scotland always stands in solidarity with those on the climate front line. It bears repeating, those who have done the least to cause climate change and are least equipped to tackle it are the people being struck by its terrible effects, first and worst. Labour will vote for the climate change bill today and celebrate what successes it has delivered for our transition, knowing that we have much more to build and to do. For decades, individuals have been turning down their thermostats at home to save the planet. Let's no longer rely on the individual alone to keep the heating down. It's time for structural collective action to keep temperatures below 1.5 and to protect the future of this planet for all. The quote goes, "Treat the earth well. It is not given to us by our parents. It was loaned to us by our children."
Thank you, Ms Beamish. I call Mark Ruskell, close to the Green Party. 4 minutes, please, Mr Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it would be perhaps remiss of me not to thank everybody who has lobbied and protested and provided evidence around this bill. There is an incredible youthful climate movement out there, which is certainly inspiring MSPs on these benches, and they are a huge strength and a huge testament. As the hundreds of emails that I have received this week spell out, the science shows that at the current rate of emissions, Scotland will have used our entire carbon budget for 2 degrees C in the next 10 years. There is no turning back from that. We will be locked into a world with more suffering. The climate crisis is deepening. A new report from the IPCC today warns that accelerating impacts on the oceans put 1 billion people at risk. And this week too, the UN has said that even if all the governments around the world meet their targets, then we would go well beyond manageable levels of climate change. So this crisis demands political risk-taking, however uncomfortable it may feel to challenge sectors like farming or oil and gas to change. It will pale by comparison to the outrage that we felt in the years to come as the real impacts of climate breakdown kick in. Now, like many other members, I can look at the long list of improvements to this bill and recognise that 10 years ago, these would have felt like big wins, steps of progress that we could all celebrate together. The tweaks to budgeting and how we measure things, the recognition of key principles around global justice and equity, the focus for action on sectors like farming and housing, the involvement of people in designing solutions through a citizens' assembly. These are all welcome gains. But when I look at the enormity of the challenge that we face, the worsening scientific picture, the risks that we are taking with our children's future, I'm saddened and angry that an opportunity to deliver real transformative change has been passed up. Instead, we have a narrow piece of legislation setting distant targets while failing to deliver the rapid, transformational and unprecedented change demanded by the IPCC. And even within the narrow scope of this bill, big opportunities have been missed. A statutory Just Transition Commission should have been the centrepiece of this bill, a body with the teeth and the focus to take on the challenges of change, ensuring that no communities are left behind in this transition. A body that should be at the heart of the... If I can get the time back, I'll take Mr.
Yes, you certainly
Carson,
can. If it's a brief intervention, Finlay Carson.
Thanks for taking the intervention. It sounds from what you're saying that you're not going to support the climate change bill at decision time tonight. So why is it that when we've all worked so hard, cross-party, there's so much more to agree on and it's so more robust and enforceable if we all agree? So why are you making grandstand comments when it's more important to have a consensus on these issues?
Mr Ruskell.
That's so disappointing for Mr Carson. If you not listen to any of the evidence that has come to our committee, the nature of this crisis demands an emergency response. Your party might be happy with this weak legislation. My party isn't. Let me get back to action, because we need to start to talk about action now that comes from this bill. A Just Transition Commission should be at the heart of a Scottish Green New Deal, planning those new regional strategies to rebuild and reindustrialise communities in a low-carbon age. Instead, it's been left to the Green and Labour parties in this Parliament to try and desperately amend this bill to give it the tools it needed on transition. And we are left with virtually nothing as a result. Monitoring reports and principles and plans will not create real lasting change that is needed in the 5 communities that I represent. Now, we won't stand in the way of the small steps of progress that have been made through this bill today, but we also won't endorse a bill that is preoccupied with distant targets while doing nothing to deliver transformative action and does not go far enough for the critical period of the next 10 years. Time is running out, and while the targets in this bill are eye-catching, they're not backed by anything that suggests the status quo is really being challenged. When we look back at this bill in the years to come, we'll see missed opportunities to drive strong progress. But there'll be no time machine to call on. It's government's job to lead and to deliver the change that is necessary. And if we don't see that necessary change, then politics and democracy will have failed.
Thank you. And I call Liam MacArthur, close to the Liberal Democrats. 4 minutes, please, Mr MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's regrettable that Mark Ruskell has chosen to take the tone that he has. I respect very much the differences of opinion that he has, not just with the government, but those of us on other benches. But I think one of the strengths, and I think Claudia Beamish mentioned it in our earlier deliberations, one of the strengths is the united front that this Parliament has put forward. And I think there's been evidence that has suggested we do many things. I don't think it's been unambiguous on many of the issues. And therefore, I think he does a disservice both to the work of the committee and of this Parliament. Deputy Presiding Officer, at stage 1, I quoted Jessie Dodman. I quoted Jessie Dodman, a young constituent from Papa Westray in Orkney, who wrote to me saying, the climate change bill offers a good first step, but needs to be delivered more quickly and effectively before the predicted deadlines for unanswerable change in 2030. Jessie's plea has been since echoed by young people from across Scotland and beyond in recent weeks and months. It stems from an understanding that urgent action is essential over the next decade if we're to have any realistic prospect of averting the catastrophic consequences of climate change, if we are to hit our net zero targets, emission targets by 2045, and if we're to deliver an appropriate response to the IPCC's latest report. I'm delighted, therefore, that Parliament has voted today to increase the interim target to 75% by 2030. I congratulate again Claudia Beamish on lodging her amendment that I was happy to co-sign, an amendment that has enabled, I think, a highly significant change to be made in the climate change bill. Some argued we should be going faster and further. These debates have been happening within as well as between parties. I'm conscious, though, that what the chair of the UK CCC said to the Eclair Committee on Target Setting, and Lord Demon cautioned that it is not sensible to espouse a target without being clear about what it really means. You can have any old target, but it will not work if you cannot come down to the terms for how you will get there. Yes, we need to be ambitious, challenging and resolute. We need to adapt as the evidence and the opportunities available change. Ultimately, though, the public must have confidence in the basis on which we are setting legislation. I think the more ambitious 75% target for 2030 strikes the right balance in terms of ambition, urgency and achievability for now. It will not be easy. It will require greater effort, more resources and involve many difficult decisions. We'll need to change our cars, retrofit our homes and industry, plant more trees than ever before, and then still we will rely on technology that doesn't even exist yet. But it is the right thing to do. It's right too that we've taken steps to better reflect the principle of equity and climate justice in this bill. Scotland, as a developed nation, bears a larger responsibility for global warming and therefore should be doing more in response. SCIAF, Mercy Courtier Fund and others are right to remind us those in the Global South who have contributed least to the creation of climate change but who are already experiencing its worst impacts have a right to expect us to step up to the plate. Deputy Presiding Officer, in 2009, the Act we passed to the process of scrutinisation was a genuinely cross-party effort. I thank colleagues for their efforts and constructive engagement, as I do the many, many external stakeholders and members of the public who have engaged so passionately and enthusiastically over recent months. I'm pleased to have been able to help strengthen the bill in areas such as international aviation, public procurement and low-emission vehicles and the use of district heating schemes. Others will point to their own successes and I warmly welcome, for example, the addition of the Climate Assembly among them. But overall, as in 2009, it's been a collective effort and that has been one of its strengths. Of course, as with any piece of legislation, passing it is very much the easy part. Delivering on the commitments contained in this bill and delivering them on time will be enormously challenging. However, the clear and present threat posed by climate change here and internationally has been laid bare by the IPCC. The expectation of the public, Jessie Dodman and millions like her, could not be clearer. Scottish Liberal Democrats are determined to make sure we rise to that challenge and look forward to supporting this historic bill at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes. Stuart Stevenson, followed by Alexander Burnett. Mr Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let me just start by wishing John Scott well and hope he will be sitting beside me when we look at the climate change plan update, because John's wise counsel, that's not to say I unequivocally agree with everything John says, but his wife's counsel will be important at that stage. Farming has been an important part of the discussion, and John has contributed to that, as others across the political parties have done. And I very much welcome the fact that we've incorporated, as a result of Maurice Golden's amendment, nitrogen accounting. That will be helpful to getting a proper understanding of farming. Now, we've had a bit of talk about, of course, the role of young activists in relation to this, and that's entirely proper. But I just want to take us back to something which I haven't heard mentioned this afternoon that is actually of equal and immediate importance now. And that is that this is a feminist issue as well as a youth issue. In that, in areas of the world, in Africa in particular, where aridification is taking place because of the diminution in rainfall, the drying of wells, And generally, it's the women who are the farmers who do actually the hard labouring in many of the countries of Africa, who are having to walk many times the distance they previously did to get water, to get kindling. So it is today an issue that is a feminist issue that's affecting women across the world. And we mustn't forget to... if I get it back, Convener.
Briefly, John Finney, please.
Thank you. I'm grateful and I would agree with these comments. Do you think if maintaining the existing road building programme will be a positive or negative contribution to these women in sub-Saharan Africa?
Stuart Stevenson.
I suspect if they had better roads in sub-Saharan Africa, it would be less of a feminist issue. But I expect that's not really the point the member is trying to make. Let's just quickly address where Patrick Harvey correctly said that the Greens advocate 50% target for 2030 in the last time round. However, the other thing we need to think about is there have been several changes to the baseline, which is added to the inventory of CO2. So we need to translate those targets in 2009 to what they would be today against today's baseline, and they'd be rather different. We also, in 2015, added another greenhouse gas to the inventory, nitrogen trifluoride. So there have been various changes that affect the way in which the numbers work. And it's just a bit more complex than we sometimes like to pretend. Now, I do want to talk briefly about the whole subject of unanimity. I strongly believe we have to be driven by scientific consensus, not by individual scientists who are at one edge of the argument or the other, particularly, not because these scientists are wrong. They will be correct within the area of their research. But it's that consensus that comes through the IPCC, and I welcome the new report that's come today. That will drive further change, as it has to. But also, that if we start to pick scientists from an extreme position, valid as they are, we allow others to choose scientists who disagree with the whole agenda altogether. That is why we should always go by the consensus. Now, there's nothing to stop us exceeding the recommendations that scientists have. So I encourage my colleagues on the green benches to think carefully about withholding their support for this while continuing to campaign for more. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, and say I'm inspired, as others have been, by Greta Thunberg and millions of young climate activists around the world. And when I cast my vote shortly, it will be thinking of her and her young companions. I'll be deed before it all matters. They have to inherit a world worth inheriting.
Thank you. Alexander Burnett, followed by Daniel Johnson. Mr Burnett, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And firstly, can I recognise the hard work that has gone into this bill from our clerks and researchers, as well as all constituents and organisations who have contributed. I'd also like to thank members across this chamber who have worked across party lines to strengthen this bill in our combined goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We are all committed to protecting our planet for future generations. Now, as members will know, I've been a strong advocate in this Parliament on improving energy efficiency in residential homes to EPC-C or above by 2030. In addition to winning a debate on the matter with cross-party support, I've tabled amendments at stage 2 to similar effect. And despite the SNP imposing this for the last 2 years, I'm very glad to see that our position is now adopted in the programme for government. Now, the Scottish Government have backed this proposal by committing 10% of capital spending on energy efficiency. Now, I was delighted to support the Green Amendment earlier to reduce emissions from housing, requiring the climate change plan to set out what measures Scottish ministers propose to ensure that emissions from housing are reduced and that housing achieves EPC-C or above where practical. And I note members to my register of interest in relation to renewable energy and housing. Now, I'd also like to add particular thanks to the Existing Homes Alliance, who have worked on finding ways to achieve these targets. And in their report last month, they touch on some of the many benefits of this approach, including reducing carbon emissions, reducing fuel poverty, reducing household energy bills by over £400 a year, and creating an economic growth with every £1 of investment giving a return of £5 in GDP, of creating over 6,000 new jobs, as we need to double the current rate of upgrades to 200 per day, and also tackling the cost of poor housing to health and well-being, an amount that currently costs us up to £80 million a year. Now, for us to find a pathway to zero carbon by 2045, Their report also sets out many policies and programmes to ensure that it would be a success. I'm particularly interested to read their 5 recommendations for programme development, delivery and support for a zero-carbon future. The Scottish Conservatives are strong advocates for the devolution of powers, and we believe that the delegation and distribution of powers are important to ensure maximum success. And so therefore, the first recommendation to extend local authority-led area-based programmes to deliver both energy efficiency and heat measures are welcome. Now, as they state, procurement should prioritise community benefit and local economic development, so introducing a programme to incentivise deep renovation where appropriate is important. Now, the Scottish Conservatives believe that actions to limit global warming will have a higher probability of success if they create jobs and support innovation. So we welcome the suggestion to increase support for self-funding households by expanding the Energy Efficient Scotland pilots. This will deliver community engagement, develop local supply chains, and ensure quality control combined with the availability of loan finance. So therefore, we must work with the supply chain to provide support in training and skills development to address gaps in certain trades and geographic areas. The move towards a zero-carbon future is one that all society must work towards in a coordinated effort, and I look forward to working with the energy sector to make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Daniel Johnson, be followed by Gillian Martin. Ms Martin is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Johnson, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is no greater political cause than that of climate change, no more urgent need for action. And it's against this context that this bill is to be welcomed. It's important, indeed it's vital, that we put our action towards tackling climate change on a legal footing with clear and practical steps towards achieving it. That is what we should be welcoming. But I think we cannot ignore the tenor of this debate, the calls to go further. And indeed, I understand the government's caution. I mean, let's be frank. We all know how the political game works. The government sets a target and opposition parties then chase to try and demonstrate how they didn't do it, and the government comes back and claims how they did it. This can't be like that. This is not a normal target. It is much more important than that. And that is why we must set targets, not because of what we think we can achieve, but because we must set targets on what we have to achieve in order to save the planet. And the science couldn't be clearer. I mean, just today we've seen more reports put before the UN demonstrating what will happen and what has been happening. That oceans have been continuously rising in temperature since 1970. That we've seen an accelerated loss in polar ice caps and glaciers. That will have the consequence of rising oceans and the possibility of a catastrophic snowball effect in terms of warming, thawing, releasing more global greenhouse gases that will lead to irrevocable climate change. So that's why we need a target, a challenge, which we might not know how we're going to deal with or measure up to. So let me draw a parallel, because sometimes there are political projects which do exactly that. In 1962, JFK gave a groundbreaking speech setting out an objective which seemed impossible, improbable, of landing human beings on the moon. And just 7 years later, that was achieved. And ever after, of course, politicians have been butchering those quotes to their own ends. And I'm going to, I'm afraid, do exactly the same thing here. Because this is something that we must do, not just because it's hard, but because it's essential. Net zero must be treated as our moonshot. We have a decade to reshape our economy and save our environment and our planet. And we must treat it with the same level of urgency, imperative, and collective effort, because failure simply isn't an option. And I think while I was thinking about this debate and preparing for it, Greta Thunberg's words rang in my ears. What she said to the politicians assembled at the UN, that you all come to us, young people, for hope. How dare you? The reality is that caution and pragmatism, and while I understand that those are the considerations of the way that government must be done in normal times and normal issues, cannot be the way that we approach dealing with climate change. We have to listen to the people that we must achieve, not just a strive for net zero, strive for 75% reduction by 2030, not even 80% reduction, but those calls saying that we must achieve net zero by 2030. We must listen to those and set ourselves the challenge of doing everything we can towards that. So That is the tenor that the remarks made in this chamber this afternoon must have. That's the way in which these criticisms and these observations must be taken by the government, not to be rebuked. These aren't political points. In fact, I would regard these as collective criticisms, collective observations of our collective failures to do what's required in order to tackle climate change. So this is our imperative. We must play our part as the nation of coal and steel, of the locomotives and ships that ushered in the first wave of globalization on this planet. We have a moral responsibility to do our bit to tackle the climate change that ushered in. And we must take the practical steps to ensure that the investment takes place, to ensure that that is what we achieve in Scotland as an example for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today we're on the cusp of passing legislation that will have a massive impact. The hugely ambitious and challenging targets set out in this bill will cross every sector in Scotland, every business, every household, every person. These targets are the goal we cannot miss, and the targets that we will commit to today will require massive system and behavioural change to achieve. Scotland will need to change, and so much of what we ask from our government, from now on, we need to take those targets into account when we make those asks across all portfolios. System change will have to happen urgently, and none more so in my area, where public transport is not an option if you live in Rothy-Norman but work in Ellen, or if your surgery appointment is in Old Meldrum but you live in Cross of Jackson. Your choices are limited if you want a home whose materials lock up carbon instead of adding to the carbon burden. You might only be able to heat your home by burning oil with a big tank out in the garden. You might live in rented accommodation where you have no choice on how to heat your home at all. Heat pumps and electric vehicles are the preserve still of the wealthy, and you can only dream of such choice. You might want to cycle to work, but given that you don't live in a cycle route, you can't take the risk of being hit by a car in the dark winter mornings. You might want to rid your home of single-use plastics, but the supermarkets are full of them. And even though you recycle everything you can, you find yourself with 2-3 bin bags of mixed refuse a week that you know is going to landfill. So your job and money that you take home to pay your mortgage and feed your kids depends on oil and gas. That's a lot of people in my area. And you hear people campaigning to keep it in the ground. But you know that if we do that too soon, your city will be a ghost town and unemployment would be rife. You only just got a decent job after losing one in 2016. So you have first-hand experience of what that's like. You want to take your skills and work in an organisation which will be part of the low-carbon revolution, but they aren't happening as fast as you'd hoped. But where you can change your life, you do. You make all the choices you can make to reduce your carbon footprint. You holiday at home instead of flying, you modify your diet, you minimise your food waste. You try to fix things rather than replace them. You go around the house switching off lights and turning down heating and shouting at your children to put jumpers on. But the big things that you want to do are out with your hands. Those big things are up to us here in this chamber and the choices we urge the government to make. I look forward to the updated climate change plan that will set in place what we need to do to achieve the aims of this bill, because we have no option but to achieve those aims. And the people of Scotland, they do want to play their part. They've told us that. Before I sit down, I just want to also pay tribute to my colleague and friend John Scott, who would have loved to have been sitting with us here, but I know for a fact is sitting at home watching us debating this. He did make a tremendous contribution. I want to thank my committee colleagues for the contributions we all made as we all went forward together, not always agreeing with one another, but reaching a consensus that Finn Carson has mentioned. And I want to thank the clerks who have steered us through that, and the many, many people. Probably we opened our doors a little wider than we actually had time for, but I think it was very important to have everyone round the table that had a locus in this, including the many young activists from across Scotland who we sat down round the table with the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We all sat in the one room, and I'm very proud that we did that. I'm proud to vote for a bill that has these ambitious targets. But from tomorrow, it's all about action. Just transition, system change, and asking tough questions of every business, corporation and agency who the citizens of Scotland rely on for work, food, transport, health and housing. This change starts with a government bill, but the actions lie with us all.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches, and they're very tight to time. Calling Sarah Boyack to close for Labour. 4 minutes, please, Ms Boyack.
Thank you very much. The 2009 Climate Change Act was of its time groundbreaking, but it now looks old-fashioned because things have moved so fast. Then the opposition party, my own party, pushed the Scottish Government very hard. We ended up with 42%. We felt that was really radical. And I have a sense of that today when we're going to support the bill that has got a radical target today. I know Claudia Beamish was up for 77%, the Greens are up for 80%. We don't know where we're going to be in a decade. The point is, what we have agreed today is not the limit. It is the absolute lowest we must reach over the next decade. And if we can go further, we should do that. And I think picking up on the last comments that have just been made by Gillian Martin, for too many of our communities, they don't have the choices we want them to have. They don't have the low carbon present that they need, and they should have the right to have. I was struck by the comments that the Cabinet Secretary, I need to get on, made in our opening remarks. The emissions that we have managed to lower, collectively through all the work that our businesses have done and government activity, the emissions have been lowered, but there are key areas that need to be activated. But the Cabinet Secretary was right to highlight that there has been economic progress in that last decade, and we need to look to the next sets of economic progress. But we need to add in at the same time the fact that our communities must not be left behind in that process. And if there's one thing I'd like us to focus on more, it's how we do that. So heating our homes, making them more energy efficient with renewable low carbon technology, and using that process to create real jobs, decent paid jobs, eliminate fuel poverty at the same time, a triple win as described by CAS in their lobbying of us today. We also need to re-engineer our communities to deliver low carbon, affordable, healthy and active travel choices, and to make that cross right across our towns, our cities and our villages as well. It needs to be across the whole country. So better buses, more affordable, more reliable trains. It is about all of those issues, not just focusing on the target, although the target will help drive us. And using our land to better effect, investing in tree planting, sustainable flood management, support for our farmers as they transition to low-carbon food and land stewardship. And nobody's mentioned today the issue of urban food production, which I think mustn't be missed out in terms of low-carbon communities. That's something that needs to be focused on as well, and it can be empowering. So I think there's an agreement across the chamber that we have a climate emergency. It's not global warming. It's not climate change that we will get round to tackling at some point. It is something we need to tackle now. We can see, even in this year, the lives that are being lost and the climate refugees that are being created. So Scotland will need to step up to the plate. Colleagues have rightly quoted from IPCC's report today and also the work of the UK Climate Change Commission. This bill is important, but it is not the end. It has now got to be the start of the next push to make sure that we really deliver on climate change. And we have to think about how we accelerate our investment in climate resilience as well as climate change. We've even had fires this year in Scotland. Places like Scotland and Siberia having fires that have gone out of control is unthinkable. So it is an emergency. And there's a powerful call for action to us today. Last week in Edinburgh, we had 20,000 young people marching in the city. Across the globe, we've seen the next generation, but they are challenging us. The placard I remember from Edinburgh was, "You will die of old age, we will die of climate change." We need to act now, we need to act together, and we need to compete with each other to make sure that we push each other further, but we've also sometimes got to work together. And I particularly want to thank the Climate Change Coalition in Scotland, all of their members, our constituents, members of the public. I also want to thank the committee
I'm afraid
for
your
their work.
thanks will have to just be global, if you don't mind.
We have a
you
duty
must
to
sit
act.
down. Sorry, no, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, you don't get 30 seconds anymore.
No,
sorry.
you have not even got 30 seconds. I give them to you willingly, Ms Boyack, if I
Let
have
us support this legislation
Thank you.
and get on with it.
I call Finlay Carson. Mr Carson, it is 5 minutes.
Beg your pardon, Presiding Officer. Wasn't quite. Excuse me. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I declare an interest as a member of the NFUS and as a partner in a former farming business. I'm pleased to be closing for the Scottish Conservatives in the final stages of what I believe is the most important bill that this current Parliament will pass. And now that this bill has been strengthened through committee amendments at stage 2 and to stage 3 amendments, I believe that this legislation will be the springboard to ensure that Scotland continues to lead the way on tackling climate change now and in the future. But also importantly, the bill recognises and goes some way in addressing the pressures that these targets will place on individuals and businesses across Scotland. And despite the narrative from some climate change activists, as a member of the Clare Committee, we have been and continue to listen. We're listening to a broad spectrum of experts, organisations and intergenerational panels to understand the measures we need and are able to take. The committee took almost 25 hours of evidence and spent 20 hours deliberating its report. All that long before the government declared a climate change emergency. So I can assure you that the committee have taken our responsibilities very seriously. And on that note, I want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to the committee, clerks, Spice and my fellow committee members, past and present, and in particular my colleague John Scott, for the commitment they have shown in ensuring that this bill is fit for purpose. This bill will ensure that the government policies will now have to start to deliver. The Committee on Climate Change outlined how Scotland can go faster and further in achieving net zero emissions. And I support the principle that we need to go further and faster for the good of both the economy and the global environment. So I fully understand the demands from many organisations and indeed some MSPs to set interim targets of 80% for 2030. But we must not ignore the importance of an evidence-based and realistic approach, and that the realistic approach favours an emission reduction target which is 75% lower than the baseline over the next decade. We cannot and should not set targets for emission reductions that are not achievable, not sustainable and not believable. It is research and science that has shown us that there is indeed a climate change emergency, and it must be research and science that leads us to the right policies to address that emergency. But let me be clear, by setting a more ambitious interim target for 2030, we've not thrown our agricultural industry under a bus. Solutions to deliver the more ambitious 75% target will be focused on a combination coming from all sectors, including industry, transport, each doing what it can. As Stuart Stevenson touched on earlier, the impact of agriculture on the environment has been badly misrepresented. Most concerningly, much of that misrepresentation has emanated from our mainstream media sources, seriously misrepresenting the IPCC report, naively and somewhat lazily applying its findings almost exclusively to the UK rather than on a global basis and on what it was intended. I can assure you that as a meat-eating nation, the best way to address global climate change is not to introduce policies to put our livestock farmers out of business. And it's important to be aware that Scotland is not self-sufficient in beef, so it's crucial that we don't displace meat production to countries with poor environmental credentials, but ensure that we eat meat that is always high-quality, grass-reared Scotch beef and lamb. Throughout the process, John Scott and I have continually reinforced that message, and I'm delighted to see, with amendments such as the nitrogen balance sheet, we now have the opportunity to recognise the hugely significant contribution Scottish farmers make in tackling climate change right here, right now. And with improved knowledge transfer and support, that contribution can be further improved in the future. Over the years, the agricultural industry has faced many challenges, and I know it will rise to this one, to the pressing challenge of climate change. My colleague Maurice Golden's amendment calling for creation of an agricultural modernisation fund will do exactly that for the farming sector through knowledge transfer, adoption of new technology and targeted support that will allow farmers to enhance their already underreported efforts in tackling climate change. As an MSP with children in their 20s and also with a 4-month-old daughter, future generations have firmly been in my thoughts as the climate change bill has made its way through my committee and ultimately today in the chamber when we vote. This generation needs to get it right and get it right now for future generations. The Scottish Conservative and Unionists welcome that this bill has been strengthened as it's progressed through the legislative process. And, Presiding Officer, we're confident that it lays the foundations for a climate change plan which will support innovation, create jobs and utilise technology, as well addressing the undeniable climate change emergency that we face.
Thank you very much. I now call Rosanna Cunningham to close to the Government Cabinet Secretary. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say I'm grateful to members across the Chamber for their mostly helpful and constructive contributions to the debate today. I think I'm right in saying that all members who lodged amendments have had at least some successes, Maurice Golden, Claudia Beamish, Mark Ruskell and Angus MacDonald. The Government has continuously sought consensus through this bill. We are facing a global climate emergency and we must all work together to tackle this. It is my strong hope that the bill can now achieve the same cross-party support that the 2009 Act has enjoyed and which, I believe, has contributed significantly to its subsequent success. Claudia Beamish has returned repeatedly to the question of putting a Just Transition Commission into legislation. I do need to remind her that we are still the only country in the world that actually has a Just Transition Commission. It is up and running and it is working hard. And I'm not sure how many times I have already explained to her why we are not inclined to put it on a statutory basis. I will try again. It would cost at least £770,000 to set up. By way of comparison, the annual contribution we make to the Committee on Climate Change is a mere £300,000. And I really have to say that it is for her to make the case as to the value that putting it on a statutory basis would add. Don't think that case has been made. I very much regret the tone. I'm going to move on because I need to get through quite a bit. I very much regret the tone of Mark Ruskell's intervention. For goodness sake, this is the strongest, toughest legislation of anywhere in the world. I find it extraordinary that the Green Party members appear to be contemplating not supporting this bill, which does set the most ambitious statutory targets of any country in the world and includes many of their own proposals. No amendments were lodged at stage 3 to propose any changes to the net zero emissions target date, or the 2020 target, or the 2040 target. It appears that the sole sticking point is the exact level of the 2030 target, where the Scottish Government has today gone even further and adopted a target of 75%. To be absolutely clear, a 75% target exceeds what is needed globally over the next decade to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And no other country, even recognised leaders such as Sweden, has set a higher target in law for that year. And it is the case that our focus must now shift to delivery. The Scottish Government will now update our current climate change plan in light of the debate here today. The update will draw on the many new and emboldened initiatives that have already been announced since the First Minister's declaration of a global climate emergency. And these include a bold package of measures on low-carbon transport, including investing £500 million to improve bus services, decarbonising passenger rail services by 2035, making a further £17 million available for zero-interest loans to support the purchase of ultra-low-emission vehicles, and working to decarbonise flights within Scotland by 2040. A range of actions to maximise the potential of every part of Scotland's land to contribute to the fight against climate change, with increased funding for peatland restoration and even more ambitious tree planting targets. We will create an agricultural transformation programme that reduces emissions whilst focusing on sustainability, simplicity, profitability, innovation, inclusion and productivity. And there are a lot more up to and including the introduction of a new deposit return system. And as ambitious as these actions are, I am under no illusion that they will be sufficient. The second half of Scotland's journey to net zero emissions will undoubtedly require different and, in many cases, much more difficult choices than has been the case to date. And all of us here will need to step up our willingness to make these decisions if the targets are to be met. No one should be in any doubt of the Scottish Government's commitment to using all policy levers at our disposal to rise to this challenge. But I could remind everybody, as I have earlier today, when providing its advice on targets in May, the CCC were absolutely clear that Scotland cannot deliver net zero emissions by 2045 through devolved policy alone. So it's welcome the UK Government has followed our lead to legislate for a net zero target. UK-wide delivery policies, however, must also now ramp up significantly. Presiding Officer, Scotland is already recognised as a world leader in tackling climate change. By the time the UN climate talks come to Glasgow in late 2020, we will have an even stronger message with which to welcome the international community to Scotland. We will have the most stringent framework of statutory targets of any country in the world. And all of us today, whatever we think, should be proud of that and support this bill. The bill before us maintains and strengthens Scotland's place at the very forefront of global efforts to do what we need to do to bring emissions down. And I am very proud to have moved the motion.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes our Stage 3 debate on the Climate Change Bill. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 19047 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding
Thank
Officer.
you very much. And no one wishes to speak on this motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 19047 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 19054, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau on the Stage 1 timetable for a bill. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And again, no one wishes to speak on this motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 19054 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 19049 on approval of an SSI. Could I ask Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And this will be put at decision time. The next item is consideration of 6 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I ask Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move motions 19048 and 19050 on approval of an SSI, 19051 on committee meeting times, 19052 on committee membership, 19053 on substitution on committees, and 19095 on designation of a lead committee?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And we'll put all of these at decision time, to which we now come. And the first question at decision time today is that motion 19025, in the name of Rosanna Cunningham, on the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Scotland Bill at Stage 3 be agreed. And members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19025 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham is yes 113. There were no votes against. There were 6 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed and the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Scotland Bill is passed. The next question is that motion 19049 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We're not agreed. In that case, sir, we'll move to a vote on motion 19049 and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19049 in the name of Graham Day is yes 89. There were no votes against. There were 28 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And I propose to ask a single question on the 6 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does anyone object? That's good. The question is that motions 19048, 19050, 19051, 19052, 19053 and 19095 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of John Mason on the need for a product recall database. We'll just take a few moments pause for members and the Minister to change seats.